Hey, welcome to Sleepy Old World. I'm so glad you're here tonight. If this is your first time finding this channel, pull up whatever you sleep with, your favorite blanket, an extra pillow, maybe a warm drink, and just settle in. This is a quiet corner of the internet, where we go places most history books skip right past. Not battlefields, not throne rooms, not the grand sweeping moments that get turned into movies. We come here for the small, overlooked, surprisingly human things. The rituals people performed without thinking. Today we are talking about milk. Specifically, we are talking about why American women in the 1950s drank so much of it, and I mean so much. A quantity and a regularity that would genuinely surprise you if you sat down and looked at it closely. We are talking about women who drank milk at breakfast, at lunch, sometimes between meals, sometimes before bed. Women who kept it in their refrigerators the way we keep our phones charged, as a matter of daily necessity. Women who drove out to farms themselves to get it, who knew the names of the cows by reputation, who talked about milk the way people today might talk about their vitamin routines or their skincare regimens. This is the story of why that happened, and it turns out there are more layers to this particular habit than you might expect. There is the science, the social pressure, the beauty culture, the post-war anxiety, the longing for something wholesome in a world that was changing very fast. There is the farm connection, the ritual of it, the way a cold glass of milk became a kind of quiet anchor in the middle of a very complicated decade. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something small. If tonight's story finds you, if it earns a little corner of your late-night listening life, would you consider subscribing to Sleepy Old World? This channel is something I put genuine care into, and every subscriber genuinely matters to me. It helps these stories reach more people who might need them, and if you feel like leaving a comment tonight, I always love knowing where you are in the world right now. It could be 2 in the morning on a Tuesday, it could be early evening on a rainy Sunday. Drop it in the comments when you can. I read them, and they mean more than you know. Now, dim the lights a little if you can. Get comfortable, really comfortable, because we are going back to a very specific version of America. The version with the neat lawns and the station wagons and the Formica countertops and the refrigerators that hummed with purpose. The version where dinner was on the table at 6 and the milk was cold and the world was trying very hard to feel safe. Let us begin. Picture a kitchen on a Tuesday morning in 1954, somewhere in Ohio, or maybe Indiana, or a suburb of Philadelphia. It does not much matter. The kitchen is clean. It always has to be clean. There is a linoleum floor in a pale green that was fashionable 3 years ago, a stove with 4 burners, a window above the sink, and a refrigerator that is, by the standards of 1954, quite new and quite good. Inside that refrigerator, taking up nearly an entire shelf, are 3 bottles of milk. Glass bottles, not cardboard cartons, each one sealed at the top with a small paper cap, each one collected from the front step this morning, or perhaps brought home yesterday from the store. Or perhaps, if this particular woman has the kind of arrangement that many women in that era did, fetched directly from a farm a few miles outside of town. The woman standing in this kitchen is in her late 20s or early 30s. She has been awake since before 6. She has eggs on the stove, toast under the broiler, coffee percolating, and she has also poured herself a full glass of milk, which she will drink standing up at the counter before her husband comes downstairs. This is not unusual. This is Tuesday, and if you had walked through the neighborhoods of almost any American suburb in the decade between roughly 1948 and 1962 and looked in those kitchens, you would have found variations of this scene repeated in house after house. Women drinking milk, women planning meals around milk, women consulting their home economics guides, their ladies' home journal subscriptions, their mother's advice, all of which said more or less the same thing. Drink your milk, 2 glasses a day, minimum, 3 is better, your bones depend on it, your skin depends on it, your children depend on it. Your husband, though nobody quite said this directly, depends on a wife who is healthy and strong and calm and well-nourished. Drink your milk. This was not simply a marketing message, though it absolutely was also a marketing message, and we will get to that. It was a genuine belief, a conviction that had been building through the first half of the 20th century and reached something like its full expression in the post-war years. The conviction that milk, specifically cow's milk, was the most complete and essential food available to the human body, and that women in particular needed it. To understand why women in the 1950s drank so much milk, you have to understand a few things at once. You have to understand what was happening to women's bodies and women's anxieties in that particular decade. You have to understand what nutritional science thought it knew about milk at the time, and how that knowledge had been filtered through decades of public health campaigns and magazine articles and school lunchrooms. You have to understand the very specific relationship that 1950s housewives had with beauty, with aging, with the fear of losing their looks, and with the hope that the right foods, taken consistently and with discipline, could hold certain things at bay. And you have to understand the milk itself, where it came from, how they got it, what it meant to have access to it, and how that access was woven into neighborhood life in a way we have almost entirely lost. We are going to go through all of it tonight, slowly, the way these kinds of stories deserve to be told. Let us start at the beginning. Let us start with what milk actually was in the 1950s, before any of the rest of this makes sense. Milk in the 1950s was not quite the same thing as what you pull out of your refrigerator today, or rather, it was the same thing biologically, the same liquid produced by dairy cows, but everything around it, the way it was produced, the way it was processed, the way it arrived in people's homes, the relationship people had with the farms it came from, all of that was different in ways that matter for our story. The post-war decade saw dairy farming reach something of a peak moment in American agricultural life. The industry was large and organized, and also still, in many places, surprisingly local. This was before the complete industrialization of the milk supply, before the era of mega dairies and ultra-pasteurization and milk that has a shelf life of 2 months and never needs refrigeration. In the early 1950s, especially in the Midwest and the Northeast and across the broad agricultural belt of the country, milk was still produced on farms that were near enough to cities and towns to deliver it fresh, and that freshness was part of what people were paying for. The milkman was not yet a nostalgic memory. He was a current fact. He came in the early hours, before anyone was awake, and he left bottles on the front step, and he took the empty ones from yesterday, and this was simply how life worked. The milk he delivered might have been processed at a local dairy, pasteurized, separated, standardized, but it had not traveled far. It had not been sitting in a distribution warehouse for a week. In many cases, people knew roughly which farms the milk came from, or at least knew the dairy by name, the way you might know a local bakery. But the milkman was only part of the picture, because scattered throughout these same communities, especially on the edges of towns and in the farmland that still pressed right up against the suburbs in those years, were actual dairy farms, small family operations mostly, a farmer and his wife, and maybe a hired hand, 100 acres or so, a herd of Holsteins or Jerseys or Guernseys, a milking barn, a tank, the daily rhythm of a dairy operation that ran on the clock of the cows, and many women in the 1950s had a direct connection to those farms. This is one of the things that surprises people most when they look at the milk culture of that decade. We tend to think of 1950s housewives as purely suburban creatures, disconnected from the land, living in tract houses, buying everything from stores, and that is partly true, especially by the end of the decade. But in the early 50s, the boundary between suburban life and rural life was much more porous than we remember. Many women who were keeping house in the suburbs in 1952 had grown up on farms or in small rural towns. Many of them had parents or aunts or grandparents who still lived on those farms. The country was not that far away. There were women in Columbus and Indianapolis and Rochester and Richmond who drove out to a cousin's dairy farm every week or two to pick up milk directly, who had standing arrangements with a farmer they knew, often a family connection going back generations, to buy milk fresh from the tank or from the farm store. Sometimes it was unpasteurized, which was technically available for sale in many states at that time, though the public health campaigns were actively pushing people toward pasteurized milk and making a strong case for why. Sometimes it was simply fresher and richer than what the grocery store carried. Whole milk, full cream, the kind where the cream rose to the top of the bottle and you had to shake it before pouring. These women knew the farmer by name. They might know his wife. They might know which cows were producing the best milk that season, in the way that people who are close to food production always accumulate this kind of knowledge without even trying. They had opinions about Jersey milk versus Holstein milk, about the difference in fat content and flavor, about how the quality changed when the cows were on spring grass versus winter hay. This was not specialty foodie knowledge in the modern sense. This was just ordinary knowledge that came from paying attention to where your food came from, and that relationship, that direct human connection to the source of the milk, gave it a quality that supermarket milk simply could not replicate. It tasted like something. It felt like something. It was not anonymous. There was a farm behind it, and a farmer, and a herd, and a piece of land that a family had been working for decades. For many women in the 1950s, drinking milk was partly about that connection. It was a thread back to something more rooted. something that predated the suburb and the tract house and the life that had been constructed around them with such speed after the war. A glass of milk from Mrs. Henderson's cousin's farm outside of town was not the same as a glass of milk from a bottle with no name on it. Even if they contained exactly the same nutrients, they were not the same experience, and the 1950s housewife knew the difference, and she cared about the difference, even if she would not have described it in those terms. Now, let us talk about what women were being told about milk in those years, because the message was everywhere, and it was consistent, and it was delivered with the full weight of scientific authority and cultural expectation combined, which is a combination that tends to be very persuasive. The nutritional science of the mid-20th century was deeply, almost devotionally committed to milk. This was not cynical marketing masquerading as science, though marketing was certainly layered on top of it. It was a genuine scientific consensus, built over decades of research, that milk was uniquely valuable as a source of nutrition, and for women specifically, two things were emphasized above all others: calcium and protein. The calcium story is the older one. By the 1950s, the link between calcium and bone health had been established well enough that it had filtered all the way down into home economics curricula and women's magazine health columns and the advice that general practitioners gave their patients. Osteoporosis was not yet the well-understood condition it is today, but the basic idea that women's bones became fragile as they aged, and that this fragility could be countered by adequate calcium intake over the course of a lifetime, was already in circulation. And milk was understood to be the primary dietary source of calcium. Full stop. Women were told this in their doctors' offices. They were told it in the pamphlets that came with their prenatal vitamins when they were pregnant. They were told it in the school lunch programs where their children were served milk every single day, because if you were making sure your children drank their milk, you were also absorbing the message yourself, the message that milk builds strong bones, milk keeps the teeth and the skeleton sound, milk is what stands between a healthy body and a fragile one. For women in their 20s and 30s and 40s, the bone health message had a particular urgency because it was connected to aging. And aging, in the 1950s beauty culture, was something women were very actively trying to manage. We will come back to the beauty dimension of this in some depth because it is genuinely fascinating and because it explains a lot about the specific way milk was marketed to women during this period. But the underlying nutritional message was this: if you want strong bones as you age, start now. Drink your milk now, while you are still young enough for it to matter. Do not wait until your bones are already fragile. The time to build that foundation is today. The protein message was slightly newer in terms of its cultural penetration. Protein as a nutritional concept had become much more prominent in the post-war years, partly because of wartime rationing and the lessons it had taught about what bodies need, and partly because of a general cultural emphasis on strength and vitality that ran through the post-war period. Milk was understood to be a high-quality source of complete protein, meaning protein that contained all the essential amino acids in sufficient quantities to support bodily function. Meat was protein, eggs were protein, but milk was protein that you could drink, and that could be incorporated into cooking, and that delivered its nutrition in a gentle, easily digestible form. For women who were spending long days on their feet, managing households, cooking and cleaning and running errands, and in many cases also doing some kind of part-time or informal work, the energy maintenance angle of milk was genuinely appealing. It was not just about bones. It was about not running out of steam by 2 in the afternoon. It was about having enough reserve to still be functional and pleasant at dinner after a full day of everything. Milk, the magazine said, sustains you. Milk keeps your energy steady. Milk is the food of endurance. And women in the 1950s had a great deal to endure, even if they were not always permitted to say so out loud. Let us talk about the beauty dimension now, because this is where the story of milk and the 1950s housewife becomes genuinely interesting in a way that I do not think gets nearly enough attention. The 1950s were a decade of extraordinary pressure on women to be beautiful. Not beautiful in some vague aspirational sense, but beautiful in very specific, very demanding, very precisely defined ways. The hourglass silhouette, the smooth, luminous complexion, the glossy hair, the look that said effortlessness while actually requiring an enormous amount of sustained effort and resources. And into this culture of beauty pressure, the milk industry moved with remarkable strategic intelligence. Milk was positioned, throughout the 1950s, as a beauty food. This was deliberate and sophisticated, and it worked because it connected a product to something women already desperately wanted. Not just health, but visible, admirable, enviable beauty. Not just strong bones that nobody could see, but glowing skin that everyone would notice. The connection between milk and skin, specifically, was something that women of that era were genuinely convinced of, and there were multiple threads to this conviction, some of them grounded in actual nutritional science, some of them more speculative, and some of them rooted in cultural tradition that went back much further than the 1950s. The vitamin A connection was the most solidly scientific. Whole milk is a source of vitamin A, and vitamin A plays a genuine role in skin health. It helps maintain the integrity of skin cells. It supports the production of new cells to replace old ones. Deficiencies in vitamin A cause dry, rough, flaking skin, among other things. So the idea that adequate vitamin A intake, partly through milk consumption, contributed to healthier skin was not invented by an ad agency. It was real. But the 1950s beauty culture took that real connection and wrapped it in something considerably more romantic. The image that circulated, through magazines, through advertisements, through the word-of-mouth advice that women shared with each other, was of milk as the secret to a woman's complexion. "Drink your milk," the message said, "and your skin will be clear and soft and luminous." The women with the best skin, the truly enviable complexions you saw in photographs, they drank their milk. They had always drunk their milk. It was the foundation of everything. There was also the riboflavin connection, which sounds less glamorous, but was understood to matter for skin and hair alike. Riboflavin, vitamin B2, is found in milk in meaningful quantities, and deficiency in riboflavin can cause chapped lips, inflamed skin, dry cracking around the corners of the mouth. Women who had these symptoms were sometimes told by their doctors to increase their dairy intake. Women who did not have these symptoms were told to keep drinking milk to ensure they never developed them. The message flowed in both directions, and then there was something more diffuse, more cultural, less biochemical, but no less real in terms of its influence. Milk was understood to be nourishing in a deep and foundational way. It was the first food, the food before all other foods, the food that the body was designed to receive from the very beginning of life. There was something almost elemental about this. Women in the 1950s who were thinking about their bodies not just as functional objects, but as things that needed tending and maintaining and caring for whom the care of the body was itself a kind of discipline and an expression of self-respect, those women found in milk a kind of anchor. Here was something pure and complete and uncomplicated. Here was something your body knew what to do with. This had an aesthetic dimension too, in the literal sense. Milk was white, cream was white. The skin that was considered most beautiful in 1950s America was pale, smooth, even-toned. The color of good skin and the color of milk sat in the cultural imagination side by side, reinforcing each other. This is not an accident. Marketing people in the 1950s were very aware of these associations, and they used them deliberately and skillfully. There were advertisements, whole series of advertisements across multiple years, showing beautiful women with beautiful skin holding glasses of milk. The text of these ads often made the connection explicit. What does she know about beautiful skin that you do not? She drinks 3 glasses of milk a day, or milk, the complexion secret of beautiful women everywhere. These were not subtle, but they were effective because they landed on ground that had already been prepared by the nutritional messaging, the medical authority, the cultural tradition, and the genuine results that women observed when they compared their own habits to their skin's condition. Women talked to each other about this. This is important to understand. The beauty culture of the 1950s was intensely communal in a very specific way. Women talked to their neighbors, to their sisters, to the women in their church groups and their bridge clubs and their neighborhood garden associations about what worked, what made your skin better, what made your hair shinier, what made you feel more vital and more like yourself even through the exhaustion of managing a household and raising children and performing the endless labor of being a respectable American wife. And through these conversations, milk kept coming up. She swears by a glass of milk before bed. Her complexion has always been remarkable, and she says it is the milk. My mother drank milk every day of her life, and her skin at 60 looked better than mine at 30. This kind of testimonial, passed woman to woman, over coffee and across fence lines, and in the fabric section of department stores, carried enormous weight, more weight, often, than any advertisement, because it came from a trusted source, because it came from someone who had no reason to sell you anything. Now let us think about the daily mechanics of this for a moment, because one of the things that I find genuinely fascinating about the milk culture of the 1950s is how it was actually integrated into the rhythms of a woman's day. It was not simply a matter of drinking a glass with dinner. It was woven through the day in multiple ways, and understanding those ways tells you a great deal about both the nutritional philosophy of the era and the texture of daily domestic life. Breakfast was the most obvious moment. A glass of milk with breakfast was standard for women who were feeding children, because children were expected to drink milk at every meal, and a mother pouring milk for her children while not drinking any herself would have felt both hypocritical and vaguely wrong. So she poured for herself too. Usually a full 8-ounce glass, cold from the refrigerator, drunk alongside her egg and her toast and her coffee. But there was also what you might call the mid-morning milk, and this was something specific to the 1950s domestic routine. Many housewives, working through the morning on cleaning and laundry and baking and the 10,000 small tasks that keeping a house required, would pause around 10 or 10:30 for a brief rest. Not a real break, because the work was never really done and the pausing always felt slightly guilty, but a moment at the kitchen counter with something to eat or drink before pushing through to lunch, and the 10:30 milk, cold, straight from the bottle, was a common version of this pause. It was practical, and it was also something else, a small ritual of self-care in a life that did not allow for very many of them. Lunch brought another glass of milk, usually, especially if children were home, because the nutritional models of the time called for milk with every meal, and what you served the children you tended to eat yourself. And then before bed, the milk last thing at night had its own set of justifications and its own small ritual quality, which we will talk about properly in a moment. Then there was the way milk appeared not just as a beverage, but as an ingredient in cooking, which was another dimension entirely of why women in this decade consumed so much of it. The 1950s home kitchen used milk continuously. Mashed potatoes were made with milk, creamed soups were based on milk, sauces, gravies, casseroles, all the dishes that defined the family dinner table in that decade used milk in quantities that would seem excessive by the standards of modern light cooking. Puddings, custards, cream soups made from scratch with a roux and milk and whatever vegetable was in season. The cheese sauces that went over macaroni and over broccoli and over anything that needed making slightly more appealing to a family of children. Women who made these dishes were consuming milk in quantities they might not even have fully tracked, because it was embedded in the cooking rather than appearing as a separate glass. But it was there, serving the same nutritional function, delivering the same calcium and protein and vitamins, just wrapped in dinner instead of appearing as a beverage. The milk came from somewhere, and how it got from that somewhere to the kitchen counter is a part of this story that I want to spend some real time with, because it shaped the relationship women had with milk in ways that go beyond simple nutrition. For the women who used the milkman, the relationship was personal, in the way that all relationships with delivery people tend to be, in the era before everything was anonymous and impersonal. The milkman came every day or every other day, early in the morning, and he left the bottles and took the empties, and the communication between household and milkman often happened through notes left in the empty bottles. Leave an extra quart this week. Skip Thursday, we will be away. 1 pint cream instead of 2 if you have it. These notes were brief and practical, but they were also real communication between real people, and they maintained a sense of connection that went beyond a purely commercial transaction. Women knew their milkman's name. Children grew up knowing the milkman's name. He was part of the neighborhood in the same way the postman was, the way the butcher at the local market was, the way the woman at the bakery counter was. These relationships were not deep or intimate, but they were genuine, and they were part of what made the suburb feel like a community rather than just a collection of houses. But the farm connection was even more significant for the women who had it. And I want to be specific here, because I think this is a piece of the 1950s milk story that tends to get lost when we talk about the decade in general terms. Across the country, but especially in the Midwest and the Northeast and the Mid-Atlantic states, there were suburbs and small cities that were still close enough to working dairy farms that a real connection was possible. These were not factory farms in any modern sense. They were family operations, often multi-generational, run by a farmer and his wife, and often their grown children, where a herd of 50 to 200 cows produced milk that was collected and processed and distributed to a local area. Women who had any connection to these farms, through family, through friendship, through the kind of neighborhood networks that were still functioning in the early 50s, often sought out that connection, because the milk from those farms was noticeably different from what arrived in bottles from the large commercial dairies. It was richer, creamier, more flavorful. The cream line, that thick layer of fat that settled at the top of the bottle before you shook it, was more pronounced. The color was sometimes faintly yellower, which indicated a higher fat content and, depending on the season, a higher vitamin content from cows grazing on fresh grass. Women who drove to pick up this milk directly from the farm were participating in something that went beyond shopping. They were maintaining a connection to an older way of life, to the land, to the biological reality of food production that was rapidly being eroded by supermarkets and convenience, and the whole machinery of post-war consumer culture. There was something meaningful about knowing the farm, about pulling into that gravel driveway and seeing the red barn and smelling the particular smell of a dairy operation, that mixture of hay and cow and milk and earth that is not exactly pleasant but is deeply, fundamentally real, about picking up your milk from a person who had been awake since 4 in the morning to produce it. Some of these arrangements were commercial, straightforward exchanges of money for milk. Others were the kind of informal agreements that work within communities of people who trust each other. My cousin will leave a couple of quarts on the back porch on Saturday mornings. Just leave the empty bottles when you bring the car around, and she will settle up with you at Christmas. This kind of arrangement was common, and it had a warmth and an ease to it that no transaction in a grocery store could replicate. The women who maintained these farm connections often felt, and sometimes said, that the milk they got directly from a farm was better for them, better in a qualitative sense that went beyond measurable nutrition, better in the way that food always seems better when you know where it comes from and you have some relationship, however distant, with the hands that produced it. They were not wrong, exactly. We now understand that grass-fed dairy does have slightly different nutritional profiles than grain-fed dairy, with higher levels of certain beneficial fats and fat-soluble vitamins when the cows are on pasture. But the specific nutritional difference was not really the point. The point was the relationship, the feeling of rootedness, the sense that you were taking care of your family with something real, something traceable, something that had not passed through too many anonymous hands before it reached you. This feeling was not just nostalgic, though there was certainly nostalgia in it. It was also a response to something genuinely new and slightly unsettling about the post-war world. America in the early 1950s was changing with a speed that was exhilarating and disorienting in roughly equal measure. The suburbs were appearing almost overnight, carved out of farmland and forest, with a speed that astonished everyone. The consumer economy was exploding, offering more convenience and more choice and more product than any previous generation had had access to. Life was becoming more comfortable, and also more abstract, more mediated, more removed from the physical realities of the natural world. Milk from a farm you knew, collected in a car you drove yourself, handed to you by a person whose name you knew, was a small act of resistance against all that abstraction, or not resistance exactly, because these women were not ideological resistors. They embraced their refrigerators and their washing machines and their new kitchen appliances with genuine enthusiasm. But they wanted to hold on to something, and the farm connection, maintained through the milk, was one of the ways some of them did it. Let us talk now about some of the specific varieties of milk that women in the 1950s were drinking, and what they believed about each one, because the distinctions matter, and they are interesting in their own right. Whole milk was the standard. This was what the milkman delivered, what the grocery store sold, what children drank at school, what the general understanding of milk referred to, unless otherwise specified. Whole milk in the 1950s meant milk that had not had any of its fat content removed, which meant it contained approximately 3.5% fat, and it was this fat content that carried much of the flavor and a significant portion of the fat-soluble vitamins, the A and D and K, that made milk as nutritionally valuable as it was claimed to be. Women who drank whole milk for its beauty and health benefits were, in this respect at least, getting the full picture of what the nutritional science was promising them. Skim milk existed, but it occupied a different cultural position than it does today. In the 1950s, skim milk was not associated with health or fitness in the way it would later become. It was associated, if anything, with poverty, or with a kind of ascetic self-denial that most women of that era were not particularly interested in. The fat in milk was not the enemy in 1950s nutritional culture. The whole dietary fat hypothesis, the idea that saturated fat caused heart disease and should therefore be avoided, had not yet fully penetrated the popular consciousness. Women in 1952 or 1954 were not particularly worried about the fat in their milk. They were drinking it because it was good for them, and the goodness included the creaminess, the richness, the very qualities that came from the fat content. Cream was a separate category entirely, something used in cooking and in coffee, occasionally in sauces, but not typically drunk straight except in the most luxurious rural household circumstances. Though I have read accounts of women who, when picking up milk directly from a farm, would occasionally simply skim the cream from the top of a fresh bottle and add it to their morning coffee, in a way that no commercial dairy product ever quite matched. This was a small domestic pleasure, the kind of thing that required both access to the right source and a willingness to pay attention to what you were doing. Buttermilk deserves a mention because it occupied a fascinating niche in the 1950s home kitchen, and specifically in the beauty practices of the era. Buttermilk, the liquid left behind after churning cream into butter, has a slightly sour, tangy taste and a lower fat content than whole milk, and it was understood throughout the 50s and before to have specific benefits for the skin that regular milk did not quite share. The lactic acid in buttermilk, which gives it its slightly tangy quality, is a gentle exfoliant and a natural humectant, meaning it draws moisture to the skin and helps with cell turnover. Women in the 1950s who were using buttermilk in their beauty routines, and there were many of them, were using something that modern aestheticians would absolutely recognize as beneficial, just without the scientific vocabulary to describe why. There were women who washed their faces with buttermilk, women who applied it to their skin as a mask and let it sit for 20 minutes before rinsing, women who drank it regularly for what they believed were internal skin benefits, women who used it as a hair rinse. These practices were passed down through families, often from grandmothers who had learnt them from their grandmothers, and they had a genuine effectiveness to them that helped maintain their credibility through the generations. If your grandmother had beautiful skin and she washed her face with buttermilk, you tended to take that information seriously. The link between the internal consumption of milk and the external use of milk or milk products on the skin is interesting because it suggests that women in this era thought about milk's beauty benefits holistically. It was not simply that drinking milk made your skin better from the inside. It was also that milk and its derivatives had direct, topical benefits that you could access from the outside. The two approaches reinforced each other. You drank your milk for your bones and your complexion and your general vitality, and you also used buttermilk on your face because the texture and the natural acids were genuinely good for skin. Both things were true, and women who did both felt, reasonably, that they were covering all their bases. Now I want to talk about the role of milk in the specifically feminine domestic day of the 1950s, because I think this is where the story becomes most vivid and most human. The 1950s Housewives' Day was structured, as we have touched on, by a fairly rigid set of expectations and routines. There was the cooking, the cleaning, the childcare, the household management, the social obligations, the maintenance of appearances and standards, and the particular kind of performance that keeping a respectable middle-class home in that decade required. Within that structure, the consumption of milk appeared at multiple points, each with its own slightly different character and meaning. Breakfast milk was practical and communal. It happened in the middle of the most complicated moment of the day, getting everyone fed and out the door, managing the needs of children and husbands simultaneously, producing a proper meal from scratch, because this was the era before boxed cereal became a perfectly acceptable breakfast substitute, and before anyone thought grabbing something on the way was a reasonable approach to the morning meal. In that context, a glass of milk was part of the machinery of the morning, necessary and efficient, consumed without much ceremony. The mid-morning milk was different. I keep returning to this because I think it is one of the most psychologically interesting moments in the domestic day. The mid-morning pause, when the husband was at work, and the children, if school-age, were also gone, and the house was quiet in a way it never quite was at any other time. This was the one period of the day when a housewife was alone in her own kitchen, and the ways women used that time, the things they allowed themselves in those hours, tell you a lot about what life felt like from the inside. Many women had a kind of small, private ritual around the mid-morning. A cup of coffee, sometimes, a piece of toast or a cookie. A moment to sit down, which was notable because sitting down in the middle of the day felt almost transgressive when there was always more to do. And in households where the milk culture was strong, a cold glass of milk was often part of this pause, not because anyone was watching, not to set a good example for the children, not as part of meal preparation, just because it was cold and good, and because drinking it felt like doing something right, something self-sustaining, something quietly smart. There is something I want to slow down and spend a moment with here, because I think it connects to something real about the psychology of that era. Women in the 1950s were under enormous pressure to give their time, their attention, their energy, their creativity, their emotional labor, their very selves, to their families and their homes and their communities and their husbands and their children. The cultural message was unambiguous on this point. A good wife and mother puts others first, always, without complaint, with a smile. Within that context, the act of drinking milk was one of the few genuinely self-directed acts of care that was not only permitted, but actively encouraged. Drinking your milk was good for you. It was investing in your own health. It was maintaining your body's strength and your skin's beauty and your bones' integrity, which in turn made you a better wife and mother because you were healthier and stronger and more capable of the endless work. So drinking milk was at once genuinely selfish, in the sense that it was for you, for your own body, and also entirely acceptable because it was justified by its effect on your capacity to serve others. This double quality, the self-care that is also an act of duty, is something I find genuinely moving about the way milk fit into the lives of these women. They could drink their milk and feel good about it on all the available levels. They were doing something nice for themselves and something responsible for their families simultaneously, and in a life that offered very few pure pleasures without strings attached. That particular combination was worth something. Let us talk about milk before bed, which is its own entire chapter of this story. The warm glass of milk before sleep was, in the 1950s, both a folk remedy and a medical recommendation, and the overlap between those two things is interesting in itself. The folk tradition of warm milk as a sleep aid is extremely old, going back well before any scientific understanding of why it might work. For generations, women had given warm milk to children who could not sleep, and taken it themselves in the nights when rest would not come easily, and passed the practice down with the simple authority of something that had worked. By the 1950s, this practice was being given scientific backing, or at least scientific plausibility, through the emerging understanding of tryptophan. Tryptophan is an amino acid found in milk and in various other foods, and the body uses it to produce serotonin and melatonin, both of which play roles in mood regulation and sleep. The relationship is actually more complicated than the simple folk understanding suggested, and the amount of tryptophan in a single glass of milk is probably not enough on its own to produce significant sedative effects. But the warmth of the liquid, the ritual quality of the act, the associations with comfort and care, the slight rise in blood sugar followed by a gradual fall, all of these contributed to a genuine, if modest, sleep-inducing effect. Women in the 1950s who drank warm milk before bed were not wrong that it helped them sleep. They just had a slightly different explanation for why than the biochemistry actually warranted. And the explanation they had, which was that milk was nourishing and calming, and that their bodies responded to it as a signal to rest, was emotionally true even if biochemically incomplete. The before-bed milk also had a beauty rationale. The idea that your body did its repair work while you slept, that the skin renewed itself during the night hours, that what you put into your body in the evening would be available as raw material for that overnight reconstruction, was a real part of 1950s beauty thinking. Drinking milk before bed was understood to be making resources available to your skin at exactly the moment when your skin was most actively using them. This reasoning is not entirely wrong, as it happens. The body does do significant cellular repair during sleep, and having adequate protein and vitamins available in that window does matter. But again, the women of the 1950s arrived at a partly correct conclusion through a pathway that mixed genuine science with something more intuitive and cultural. The warm milk before bed was also one of the few things women did purely for themselves in the last moments of the day, after the dishes were done and the children were in bed, and the husband was settled, and the house was finally quiet. There was something about the warmth of it, cupped in both hands, and the quiet of the kitchen, and the slight sweetness, that made it feel like a closing ritual, a gentle way of marking the end of the day, a way of saying, I did a lot today, and now I am going to take care of myself for exactly this one small moment before I sleep. I keep thinking about that. The quiet kitchen, the one small light left on, the warm glass, the particular exhaustion of having been useful and present and capable for so many hours, and the milk, which required nothing of you except that you drink it and be nourished by it. No performance attached, no one watching, just the warmth and the quiet and the sense of something sufficient. That is a small thing, and also not a small thing at all. Now let us spend some time with the actual nutritional picture, because I want to give you the real story of what milk was doing for these women, not just what they believed it was doing, though both matter and both are part of the story. Milk is one of the most nutritionally complete foods that exists. This is not marketing language, this is biological fact. It was designed, in the evolutionary sense, to sustain life from its very beginning, to provide everything a very young mammal needs to grow and thrive in the period before it is able to eat a varied diet. Cow's milk is not identical to human milk. The balance of nutrients is different in various ways, but it is still a remarkable package of protein, fat, carbohydrate, calcium, phosphorus, magnesium, potassium, vitamin A, multiple B vitamins including B12 and riboflavin, and in the 1950s United States, where milk was being fortified with vitamin D as a standard practice, it was also one of the primary dietary sources of that particular vitamin. Vitamin D deserves a moment here because its role in women's health is genuinely significant and was understood to be significant even in the 50s, though the full picture was not yet clear. Vitamin D works together with calcium to support bone mineralization. Without adequate vitamin D, the body cannot properly absorb the calcium it takes in, which means all that calcium-rich milk is less effective than it would be if the vitamin D were also present. The fortification of milk with vitamin D, which became standard in the United States beginning in the 1930s and was well established by the 1950s, was a major public health achievement, and it largely eliminated rickets, the bone disease of severe vitamin D deficiency, from the American population. For women specifically, the combination of calcium and vitamin D, delivered by a daily habit of milk drinking, was genuinely protective. The research on this is clear enough that even with everything we now know about dairy that the 1950s did not know, the basic recommendation that women should get adequate calcium and vitamin D has never really been revised. What has changed is our understanding of where those things can come from, and our recognition that dairy is not the only source. But in a 1950s diet that was not particularly rich in fatty fish, that relied on foods rather than supplements, and that was produced in a part of the world where winter sun exposure was often insufficient to produce adequate vitamin D through the skin, milk with its vitamin D fortification was filling a real nutritional gap. The women who drank their 3 glasses a day were doing something measurably beneficial for their long-term bone health. The calcium was building and maintaining bone density in the years when that density could most effectively be built and maintained. The vitamin D was ensuring that calcium was being absorbed properly. The protein was supporting muscle maintenance, which matters for bone health too, because muscle and bone support each other, and you cannot maintain skeletal integrity over a lifetime without maintaining the muscular framework that surrounds it. Was the effect as dramatic as the advertising suggested? Probably not. Beauty is complex, and a glass of milk cannot override genetics or sun damage or the natural processes of aging. But the nutritional foundation that milk was providing was real, and women who maintained it throughout their 30s and 40s and into their 50s were likely in better skeletal health in their later decades than women who did not. Now I want to talk about something that tends to get overlooked in histories of the 1950s milk culture, and that is the role of the women's medical establishment, such as it was, in both reflecting and shaping women's milk habits during this period. The post-war years saw a significant expansion in the reach of medical advice into domestic life. Magazines like Better Homes and Gardens, Good Housekeeping, Ladies' Home Journal, McCall's, all the publications that defined the reading life of the American housewife, carried regular columns by doctors, by nutritionists, by home economists who had graduate degrees and academic credentials and who translated the findings of nutritional science into practical advice for women managing households and families. These columns were read with attention, and their advice was taken seriously. They represented authority at a time when authority carried considerable weight, when a doctor's recommendation was not something you questioned but something you followed. And the advice that came consistently out of these columns, from the late 1940s through the late 1950s, was very consistent on the matter of milk. Drink it, every day, multiple times a day. This is not optional. This is foundational to your family's health and to your own. The framing was often specifically feminine. The articles addressed women as the managers of their family's nutritional health, which they were understood to be in that era, and made the case for milk in terms of their responsibilities in that role. A woman who ensured her family drank adequate milk was a good manager of her household's health. A woman who let the milk habit slip was failing at a fundamental duty. The milk had to be there, in the refrigerator, cold and fresh and sufficient, because that was what a responsible homemaker provided. This framing was simultaneously empowering and oppressive, in the way that so many things in the 1950s domestic culture were. It gave women genuine authority in the realm of the household's nutritional decisions, recognized their knowledge and their management skills, and also placed the entire burden of responsibility for those decisions squarely on their shoulders, with a clear implication that failure would have consequences. Your family's health is in your hands. Act accordingly. Women absorbed this message and internalized it, and the milk habit became part of how they understood their own competence and worth as homemakers. Keeping the milk supply reliable and fresh and sufficient was a small but real piece of what it meant to be good at the job. And in a decade when that job was the primary identity and the primary source of social status for most women, the stakes around getting it right were not trivial. The nutritional authority of the home economics field also played a significant role here, and I want to spend a moment with it because it is interesting in its own right. Home economics in the 1950s was a serious academic discipline, taught at universities, supported by government agencies, integrated into high school curricula nationwide. Women who had studied home economics often had genuinely sophisticated nutritional knowledge that was in many respects ahead of what their general practitioner husbands might have been able to provide on the topic of food and health. The milk advocacy that came out of the home economics tradition was grounded in the nutritional science of the time, and it was delivered with the authority of people who had actually studied the matter. The home economist writing for a magazine or teaching a community class on nutrition was not guessing. She was applying a framework that she had been trained in, that she believed in, and that the science of her era supported. The framework had some gaps and some errors, as all scientific frameworks do when viewed from a later vantage point, but it was not pseudoscience. It was the best available knowledge, applied with genuine care for the people receiving it. Let us take a step back and look at the broader social context, because the milk habit did not exist in isolation. It existed within a whole web of post-war aspirations and anxieties that shaped everything about women's domestic lives in the 1950s. The post-war period in America was defined, in ways that affected everything, by a very specific kind of optimism and a very specific kind of fear. The optimism was about prosperity, about the future, about the possibility of a good life that the war years had interrupted and that now seemed finally, genuinely within reach. The fear was harder to name, but it was everywhere in the culture. The fear that things might not hold, that the prosperity could be lost, that the good life, once achieved, was fragile and had to be actively maintained. In women's domestic lives, this tension expressed itself partly through the obsessive attention to health and nutrition that characterized the decade. Eating well, taking care of your body, ensuring your family ate the right things in the right quantities. These were ways of exercising control in a world that felt, at some level, slightly out of control. You could not prevent a nuclear war. You could not guarantee your husband's employment, or your children's future health, or any of the large-scale things that the decade made people anxious about. But you could make sure the milk was on the table. You could make sure you drank your 3 glasses a day. You could do the small, concrete, immediate things that the experts told you were good for your family's health. And in doing them, you could feel that you were building something, protecting something, maintaining something that mattered. Health, in this context, was not just health. It was a form of resistance to uncertainty, a way of saying, I cannot control everything, but I can control this. And the milk habit, specific, measurable, actionable, something you could either do or not do, fit very neatly into this psychology. There was also the question of weight and body shape, which is impossible to fully separate from the milk story in the 1950s, even though it complicates the narrative somewhat. The 1950s beauty ideal was emphatically not the thin ideal that would dominate later decades. The post-war ideal was the hourglass figure, curves in the right places, a small waist but also fuller hips and a real bust, the kind of physique that required a body with actual flesh on it, not a body reduced to angles and bones. Marilyn Monroe's figure, which was the aspirational template for the decade, was not thin in any modern sense. It was soft and full and voluptuous, and maintaining that kind of figure required eating, including eating fat and including drinking whole milk. In this context, the full-fat milk that women were drinking was not fighting against their beauty goals, it was serving them. The creaminess and the richness of whole milk were not threats to the figure, they were part of what maintained the slightly rounder, softer body that the decade admired. This is genuinely different from the relationship women would develop with dairy in later decades, when skimmed and reduced fat options became associated with healthy restraint and whole milk became something vaguely indulgent and suspect. In the 1950s, the fat was fine. The fat was part of the point. Women who drank their whole milk were maintaining their curves, nourishing their complexions, building their bones, sustaining their energy. The milk was working for them on multiple fronts simultaneously, and that comprehensive usefulness was part of why the habit was so deeply embedded. Let me tell you now about some of the specific beauty preparations involving milk that women in the 1950s were using, because these represent a fascinating intersection of the nutritional and the cosmetic dimensions of the milk culture. The milk bath is perhaps the most famous, and its reputation predates the 1950s by centuries. Cleopatra's legendary baths of ass's milk are apocryphal, but the tradition of using milk in bathing preparations is ancient and widespread, and it survived quite vigorously into the 20th century, including into the 1950s American home. Women who could afford to, which in most cases meant women who had ready access to whole milk from a farm, occasionally added several cups of whole milk or buttermilk to a warm bath. The lactic acid in the milk, and particularly in buttermilk, acted as a very gentle exfoliant on the skin of the body, removing dead skin cells and leaving the skin noticeably smoother and softer. The fats in the milk also provided a light emollient effect. None of this required expensive products or complicated preparations. It required only a bathtub, warm water, and the willingness to pour a couple of quarts of milk into it. Women who did this regularly reported, and still do report, that the skin on their bodies had a different quality after milk baths, softer, more even in texture. The effect is real, and it is not placebo. The chemistry of lactic acid on skin is well documented, and a milk bath delivers it in a gentle, dilute, genuinely pleasant form. Buttermilk as a face wash was even more common, partly because it required less milk, and partly because the face was where the visible evidence of any skincare practice was most apparent and most socially significant. Women who used buttermilk to wash their faces were not behaving unusually for their time. It was one of those practices that appeared in women's magazines, in home remedies books, in the informal advice networks of neighborhoods and families. The buttermilk face wash was simple. You wet your face, applied buttermilk with a cotton pad or a soft cloth, let it sit for a minute or two, then rinsed it away. The gentle acidity helped dissolve surface dirt and old makeup. The lactic acid performed its mild exfoliant function. The proteins in the buttermilk had a very slight tightening effect on the skin, and the whole preparation was so gentle that even women with sensitive or reactive skin could usually tolerate it without any irritation. Some women made buttermilk masks, a slightly more concentrated version of the same thing. You would apply a thicker layer of buttermilk to the face, leave it for 15 or 20 minutes until it began to dry slightly, and then rinse. Women who did this regularly described their skin as clearer and more refined in texture, less prone to the occasional breakouts that troubled adult women in their 30s and 40s, smoother in the way that made applying powder or rouge easier and more effective. There was also milk cream, the thick fatty layer that rose to the top of unhomogenized fresh milk, which some women collected and applied directly to very dry patches of skin, to the elbows and hands and heels where skin tended to get rough and cracked. This was essentially free cosmetic preparation if you had access to unhomogenized fresh milk, and it worked because the fat content was high and the consistency was rich and protective. The buttermilk hair rinse was another practice that appeared regularly in the beauty columns of women's magazines and in the informal advice of women sharing what they knew. After washing the hair, you would pour diluted buttermilk over it, work it through to the ends, let it sit for a few minutes, and rinse it away. The lactic acid in the buttermilk helped remove mineral deposits that could make hair look dull, helped close the hair cuticle for a smoother shine, and left the hair feeling clean and slightly conditioned without heaviness. Women who did this regularly tended to report that their hair had better shine and less frizz, which is consistent with what the chemistry of lactic acid does to the protein structure of hair. All of these practices together created a beauty culture in which milk was not just a food but a resource, something that moved between the kitchen and the bathroom, between the inside of the body and the outside of it, serving multiple functions simultaneously. The women who participated in this culture were not naive about it. They were observational and practical. They tried things, they noted results, they kept doing what worked and abandoned what did not. And across a very wide community of women, across the decade, the things that worked kept pointing back to milk. Now let us think about the economic dimension of this, because the milk habit was not cost-free, and the way women managed its costs tells you something about how seriously they took it. Milk in the 1950s was not expensive relative to the family budget in the way that some health foods today can feel prohibitively costly, but it was also not trivial. A quart of milk in 1955 cost somewhere around 25 to 30 cents. A family drinking the recommended amounts would go through 10 to 14 quarts a week, which represented a meaningful line item in the household food budget. Women who were managing tight budgets, and many were, even in the supposedly prosperous 1950s, made choices about milk carefully. They might ensure the children got their full quota before considering their own consumption. They might drink their own milk somewhat less freely than the magazine suggested, prioritizing it as a cooking ingredient when supply was limited. They might, in some cases, be the ones in the family who quietly went without when there was not quite enough to go around. This is a small detail, but it is a revealing one. The self-sacrificing logic of putting the family first, which ran through so much of the domestic culture of the decade, could even extend to milk. Some women managed the milk supply the way they managed everything else in the household, as a resource to be allocated most efficiently, with their own needs considered last. But other women were very deliberate about protecting their own milk consumption, partly because they had internalized the beauty and health arguments strongly enough that they understood their own well-being as genuinely important, not just as a means to serving others. Women who had the money and the access and the conviction tended to drink their milk consistently and without apology because they understood it as an investment in themselves that paid dividends in their capacity to do everything else they were expected to do. And the women who had farm access, who drove out and collected milk directly, were often spending less money on a higher quality product than their neighbors who relied entirely on commercial dairies. The farm milk might cost the same or slightly less per quart, and it arrived in the relationship with a neighbor or a cousin or a friend, which added a layer of warmth and community to what was also a purely practical transaction. Let me tell you about a specific moment in the daily ritual of 1950s milk culture that I find particularly evocative and that I think captures something essential about what the milk habit meant in the context of the decade. The moment of putting away the milk. This might seem like the least interesting possible topic, but bear with me, because the details of how women managed their milk supply tell a small but true story about domestic life in those years. When the milkman came in the morning, or when the groceries were brought in, or when the farm trip yielded its bottles, the first thing a woman typically did was put the milk in the refrigerator. In order to do this, she opened the refrigerator, which was one of the newer and more valued appliances of the era, which hummed and ran and maintained the cold with a reliability that earlier generations had never been able to take for granted. She put the new bottles in the back, moved the older ones to the front for use first, checked how much was left, made a mental note of how quickly they were going through it, calculated whether she needed to adjust the order or make an extra trip. This is very small-scale domestic management, but it was happening dozens of times a week in millions of households, and the care with which women performed it reflects something about the status of milk in the household economy. Milk was managed thoughtfully, not carelessly. It was tracked. Its use was noted. It was not something that simply appeared and disappeared without attention. It was tended. This attentiveness to the milk supply is connected to the larger attentiveness that defined domestic life in the 1950s, the constant low-level management of household resources that fell entirely to women and that nobody, including the women themselves, typically recognized as a form of skilled labor. But it was skilled labor, it required knowledge, planning, judgment, and consistency, and the milk was part of it. Women who maintained that attentiveness to the milk were also, on some level, attending to the health of their households in a way that felt genuinely purposeful. Not in a grand sense, not in a way that anyone would praise or notice, but in the quiet, ongoing, incremental way that most of domestic life worked. You did the thing, every day, and the cumulative effect of doing it every day was the difference between a well-managed household and a neglected one. Now I want to turn to the flavor dimension, which is something I have been circling around and want to address directly, because the taste of 1950s milk was genuinely different from what most of us drink today, and that difference was part of why women liked it. Modern commercial milk is homogenized, which means it has been processed to break up the fat globules so they distribute evenly throughout the liquid and do not separate. This gives modern milk a uniform, consistent texture that is pleasant and inoffensive, but also somewhat neutral. You can drink it without thinking about it particularly. It does not demand attention. The unhomogenized milk that was still common in the early 1950s, particularly the farm milk that women went out to collect directly, was different in the most sensory way possible. The cream separated and rose to the top. The first pour from a bottle, if you had not shaken it, was thick and rich and almost yellow, dense with fat. The milk below that cream layer was slightly thinner and more watery tasting. You had to shake the bottle before you poured, and the shaking was its own small ritual, and the milk that came out was a genuinely heterogeneous mix of fat and liquid that tasted of something. It tasted, specifically, of what the cows had been eating. In spring and early summer, when cows were on fresh grass, the milk had a particular sweetness and a faint green quality, almost floral. In winter, when the herd was on hay and grain, the flavor was different, more neutral, slightly richer. Women who got their milk from the same farm across seasons learnt to notice these differences the way wine drinkers learn to notice vintage variations. They might not have described it in those terms, but they were tasting the seasons in their milk, and that was interesting, and it made the milk itself more engaging as a substance. Pasteurized whole milk from the commercial dairy was more consistent, but still considerably richer and more flavorful than the ultra-pasteurized homogenized product that would become the norm in later decades. The high-temperature processing that came later stripped more of the volatile compounds that contribute to milk's flavor, and the resulting liquid was cleaner and more neutral, but also somewhat flatter. Women who drank milk in the early 1950s were drinking a product that had more character, and that character made the habit more pleasurable and therefore easier to maintain. Cold whole milk, drunk in a glass, in the middle of a summer morning, has a creamy richness that is genuinely satisfying in a way that goes beyond nutrition. It is cooling and dense and sweet in a subtle, natural way. There is a reason why cold milk is one of the foods that people reliably describe as comforting. The temperature, the fat content, the protein, the sugars, together they produce a sensation of completeness, of having met the body's needs that is hard to replicate with most other beverages. Women in the 1950s who drank their milk cold from the refrigerator in the middle of a hot July morning were not just consuming calcium, they were experiencing something that felt good in the body. And feeling good, in a decade that offered women relatively few purely physical pleasures that were socially sanctioned and cost-free, was not nothing. Let me talk now about the social dimension of the milk habit, because this too is part of the story, and it is one that tends to get underplayed. Milk in the 1950s was not an individual food, it was a family food, a communal food, a food that appeared at the table for everyone, and that bound people together in a shared practice. But the woman in the household was the one who managed that practice, who ensured the supply, who poured the glasses, who modelled the habit for her children. And in doing so, she was also performing her own participation in the culture of milk in a way that had social meaning. When a neighbour came for coffee in the mid-morning and a woman offered milk in addition to the coffee, she was expressing something about her household. When she told a friend that she got her milk from a farm out on Route 17, where the Kovacs family had a dairy herd, she was sharing information and also sharing a connection, offering her friend access to something she valued. When she discussed with another woman the comparative merits of Jersey versus Holstein milk, or the difference between spring milk and fall milk, or the way buttermilk worked better than cream for a particular skin condition, she was participating in a community of knowledge that had real value and real purpose. These conversations happened constantly, in the register of women talking about food and health and domestic management that was so constant and so taken for granted that it barely registered as conversation at all, more like the background music of female domestic life in the decade. But within that background music, real information was being exchanged, real knowledge was being transmitted, real community was being maintained. The woman who knew where to get good milk and who shared that knowledge was a useful member of her community. The woman who knew about buttermilk for the skin and passed that on to a friend with a troubled complexion was providing a genuine service. The woman who brought a quart of farm milk to a neighbour who was sick or recovering from childbirth was offering comfort in a concrete, nourishing form. Milk, in other words, was a currency of a kind, not financial currency, but social currency, the medium through which care and knowledge and connection were expressed and exchanged. This is one of the ways in which a simple daily habit like drinking milk was embedded in something much larger, in the web of relationships that made neighbourhood life feel like community rather than just proximity. I want to talk now about some of the specific advertising campaigns and media representations of milk in the 1950s, because they are fascinating as cultural artifacts and because they illuminate, quite directly, what the people producing them understood about what women wanted and feared and hoped for in that decade. The dairy industry in the 1950s was one of the most sophisticated and well-funded lobbying and marketing operations in American agriculture, and it directed a substantial portion of its resources toward women, who were rightly identified as the primary decision-makers for household food purchases. The campaigns that resulted were extremely well-targeted, and they were effective in part because they were speaking to anxieties and aspirations that were already real, not manufacturing needs from scratch but amplifying existing concerns. The beauty angle was everywhere. Magazine advertisements showed women with clear, glowing, perfectly even complexions alongside text that linked that skin to milk consumption. The connection was never stated with quite enough specificity to be falsifiable. The ads did not say, "Drink this much milk and your skin will look like this." They said, "Women with beautiful skin drink milk." They were careful to create an association rather than a causal claim, because the association was defensible and the causal claim was not something the evidence could fully support. But the association worked because it was landing on ground already prepared by the nutritional science and the folk wisdom and the neighborhood conversations. Women were already inclined to believe that milk was good for their skin. The advertisements confirmed and amplified a belief that was already there. The bone health messaging was more explicitly scientific and more directly tied to fear. These campaigns showed women aging, becoming frail, losing independence, and positioned adequate milk consumption as the preventive measure. The visual language was not dramatic, but the emotional subtext was. Here is what happens to women who do not take care of their bones. Here is what can be prevented if you act now. Here is the one habit that the evidence consistently supports. This messaging resonated powerfully with women in their 30s and 40s who were watching their mothers age and beginning to feel the first intimations of their own changing bodies. The fear of losing physical capability, of becoming a burden, of aging in a way that diminished rather than dignified, was very real, and the milk industry spoke to it directly. The family health angle was perhaps the most ubiquitous because it connected to the most central identity of the decade's housewife. The advertisements showed children thriving, husbands energetic, families healthy and vital, with the milk in the center of it all. The woman who provided the milk was providing the health. Her purchasing decision, her daily management of the household food supply, was the invisible infrastructure on which all that visible flourishing rested. This was both accurate and manipulative, in the way that the best advertising usually is. It accurately reflected that women's food management decisions did matter for family health. It was manipulative in the way it used that truth to generate a sense of responsibility and potential guilt that kept the habit in place, even when it might have been more convenient to let it slip. But I want to be careful not to read the women of the 1950s as simply passive recipients of these advertising messages. They were not. They were thinking people, capable of evaluating what they were told, drawing on their own experience, adjusting their habits based on results they actually observed. The milk culture of the decade was not purely a creation of the dairy industry. It arose from a genuine convergence of things: the real nutritional value of milk, the real beauty benefits of certain dairy preparations, the real pleasure of cold whole milk in a glass, the real satisfaction of a habit that felt purposeful and health-giving, the real social and emotional meanings that had accumulated around the substance over time. The advertising exploited all of that, yes, but it did not create it. The women were already there, with their bottles and their farm connections and their buttermilk face washes and their warm glasses before bed, doing something that was genuinely good for them and that they genuinely understood as good for them. The industry was following a river that was already flowing, not digging the channel themselves. Let us talk now about some of the variations in the milk habit across different regions and different kinds of households, because the picture was not uniform and the variations are interesting. In the South, dairy culture had a slightly different character. The traditional Southern diet was in many ways already rich in dairy, through buttermilk in baking, through cream in cooking, through the Southern tradition of using dairy fat as a primary cooking medium in ways that Northern cooking had moved somewhat away from. Buttermilk was perhaps more centrally positioned in Southern women's cooking and beauty practices than in Northern ones, simply because it had a longer and more embedded history there. In the rural Midwest, the connection to dairy farming was often direct and close in ways that felt different from the suburbs. Women who had grown up on dairy farms, or whose families still ran them, had a relationship with milk that was not mediated by any advertising or home economics column. It was the substance of daily life from childhood: the smell of the milking barn, the sound of the milking machines, the morning collection of the fresh milk, the cream separator. All of it was the texture of ordinary experience. For women who had grown up in this context and then moved to town, the habit of drinking milk regularly was simply continuous with everything they had always known. In immigrant communities, the relationship with dairy was more varied and sometimes more complicated. Italian-American women had a tradition of cheese-making and dairy cooking that was culturally specific and did not necessarily map onto the mainstream American milk-drinking habit in straightforward ways. Eastern European immigrant women often had their own traditions of fermented dairy, of soured milk and kefir, and similar preparations that were understood in their communities to be particularly beneficial for health. These traditions sometimes ran parallel to the mainstream American milk culture and sometimes intersected with it in interesting ways. African American women in the 1950s occupied a particularly complicated relationship with dairy, partly because of the different rates of lactose intolerance across populations, which means that some African American women experienced digestive discomfort from drinking large quantities of milk, and partly because of the economic and geographic inequalities of the era that could make access to fresh, high-quality dairy more difficult in some communities than others. The milk culture of the 1950s was in many ways a predominantly white middle-class culture, and its reach and resonance were not uniform across the full diversity of American women's lives. But within the populations where the milk habit was most deeply embedded, the story was consistent enough that it is worth treating as a coherent cultural phenomenon, which it genuinely was. Let me tell you about some specific women, not historical figures but composite portraits drawn from the kinds of accounts and documents and oral histories and magazine letters that survive from the decade, because I think the human-scale story is the most telling one. Think of a woman named Barbara, in her early 30s in 1953, living in a suburb of Cleveland with her husband Harold and their 3 children. Barbara grew up in rural Pennsylvania, not on a farm herself, but within easy visiting distance of her grandparents' farm, and she has a connection to the land and to the food that comes from it that she has carried with her into her suburban life. She gets her milk from a dairy farm about 12 miles outside of Cleveland, run by a family she has come to know through her church. She drives out there every Thursday morning after dropping the older 2 children at school and before the youngest's nap. She buys 2 gallons, sometimes 3 if it has been a thirsty week. She knows which cows are producing the richest milk that season. She talks to the farmer's wife about the children, about the church, about the vegetable garden. She comes home with the milk in the trunk, cold and fresh, and puts it in the refrigerator, and feels a satisfaction that the Thursday trip has been made and the week is provisioned. Barbara drinks milk in the morning, and sometimes at lunch, and always before bed. She washes her face with buttermilk twice a week, a habit she learnt from her mother, and her skin at 32 is something her neighbours comment on. She does not mention the buttermilk. It feels private, a little eccentric maybe, or at least not something she particularly wants to explain to someone who might find it odd. She has read the articles in Good Housekeeping about calcium and bone health. She believes them. She also believes, because she has watched the evidence accumulate in her own family's faces, that the women who drink their milk consistently look younger longer. Her grandmother, who died at 74, had skin that seemed impossibly fine and smooth for her age. Her grandmother had drunk milk every day of her life and used cream on her hands every night. Barbara connects these facts in a way that is not entirely scientific, but is not entirely wrong either. Or think of a woman named Dorothy, 44, in a suburb of Minneapolis, whose children are grown enough that the household has shifted and the rhythms of her day are different from when the children were small. Dorothy is in the phase of domestic life that comes between the intense years of active mothering and whatever comes next, and she is, in a quiet way that she would not name to anyone, anxious about aging. She has noticed changes in her body in the last few years. Her joints ache more in the cold. She has felt a couple of times the sudden awareness of her own skeleton, the sense of it as something that requires attention and maintenance in a way it did not used to. Her doctor has told her to keep up her milk. Dorothy drinks 2 full glasses a day, morning and evening. She has a specific glass that she uses for her morning milk, a green depression glass tumbler that she has had since before she was married, and the milk goes into that glass every morning without fail. She is not sure whether it is the milk that has made her feel well, or simply the habit itself, the small consistency of it in an era of considerable change, but she does not intend to find out by stopping. Or think of a younger woman, 22-year-old Susan, who has been married for 1 year and is keeping her first real household. Susan grew up in a city, did not have any direct connection to farms, bought everything from the grocery store, and is still working out what she actually believes about food and health versus what she has simply inherited from her family without examination. She reads her magazines carefully, and she has absorbed the milk messaging with the uncritical openness of someone who is still forming their domestic habits rather than simply continuing established ones. She drinks her milk because the magazine says to, and because the woman in the apartment next door, who seems to know what she is doing, also drinks milk, and because when she examined the evidence it seemed genuine rather than simply commercial. She is right that the evidence is genuine, mostly. She is beginning to find her footing. These 3 women, Barbara and Dorothy and Susan, are different ages and different temperaments and in different phases of their domestic lives, but they all have the milk in common. They are all maintaining some version of the daily habit, for overlapping but not identical reasons, in ways that have the same cumulative effect on their bodies and their days. This is what a cultural practice looks like from the inside. Not a monolithic uniformity, but a family of habits that share enough characteristics to be recognizable as the same thing, while accommodating the full range of individual variation that actual human lives involve. Now I want to think carefully about what was actually happening to the bodies of women who maintained the milk habit through their reproductive years and into their 40s and 50s, because the nutritional story here is worth telling in some detail, because it has implications that reach forward in time in ways the women of the 1950s could not have fully understood. The period of maximum bone density in women occurs in the late 20s and early 30s. This is the peak, after which the density begins a slow and gradual decline that accelerates significantly after menopause, when the protective effects of estrogen on bone metabolism are removed. The single most effective thing a woman can do for her long-term bone health is to enter that postmenopausal period with the highest possible starting bone density, and the most effective way to build bone density in the years when it can still be built is adequate calcium and vitamin D intake combined with weight-bearing exercise. Women in the 1950s who were drinking 3 glasses of whole milk a day throughout their 20s and 30s and 40s were doing precisely what the science of bone health, both then and now, would recommend. They were maintaining their calcium intake at the level that supported continued bone remodeling and density maintenance. The vitamin D fortification in the milk was ensuring that the calcium was bioavailable, and while the exercise dimension of bone health was not yet as well understood as it would become, women managing households were generally getting the weight-bearing activity that bone health requires through the physical work of cleaning and cooking and laundry and childcare. The women who maintained the milk habit conscientiously throughout their middle decades were, in all probability, entering their 50s and 60s with somewhat better bone density than comparable women who had not. This is a modest effect, not a dramatic one. Genetics and body weight and other factors all play significant roles, but the modest effect compounded over decades of consistent intake is real, and its consequences for the quality of life in later years are real as well. Fractures in older women, particularly hip fractures, are not simply painful and inconvenient, they are life-altering events that can initiate a cascade of health decline from which many women never fully recover. The reduction in fracture risk that comes from better bone density is not abstract. It is the difference between an older woman who falls and gets up and an older woman who falls and does not. The women of the 1950s who drank their milk could not have articulated the mechanism in these terms, but they were doing something, quietly, daily, without drama, that was genuinely protecting them. This is one of the things I find most moving about this entire story. The fact that a daily habit so ordinary, so unglamorous, so seemingly small, the decision to pour a glass of cold milk in the morning and drink it before breakfast, repeated for decades without fanfare or credit, was quietly building something real in the architecture of the body. These women were taking care of themselves in the most literal and invisible way possible, and the effects of that care were deposited in their bones and would only become fully visible, or rather would only fail to become visible, in the decades that followed. They were banking future health without knowing exactly what they were saving for, and that is a kind of wisdom, even when it is not fully conscious of itself. Let us spend some time now with the sensory and emotional experience of the milk habit, because I think this is the part of the story that is hardest to access from the outside and most worth trying to understand from the inside. There is a particular quality to cold whole milk that is very difficult to describe without simply saying, it is good. It is satisfying in a way that involves the whole body, not just the taste, the coldness. The slight resistance of the liquid, which is thicker than water, which has weight and presence in the mouth. The sweetness, which is subtle and natural, the sweetness of lactose rather than added sugar, a sweetness that does not cling or leave residue, but simply rises and falls cleanly. The fat content, which coats the mouth very gently and produces a brief pleasant warmth after the cold of the liquid itself. Women in the 1950s were drinking this every day, multiple times a day, sometimes in hot weather, when the cold was particularly welcome, sometimes in cold weather, when the warmth that followed was its own small pleasure. The habit was not a sacrifice. It was not a medicine to be taken grimly for its beneficial effects. It was something that tasted good and felt good and made the body feel provisioned and ready. This pleasure dimension matters because it explains the sustainability of the habit. People maintain habits that feel good far more effectively than habits that require ongoing willpower to sustain. The milk habit did not require willpower once it was established. It required simply the continuing availability of milk, which women managed as part of their domestic routine, and the continuing decision to reach for it rather than something else. The pleasure of the milk made that decision easy. Warm milk before bed had a different sensory quality that served its different purpose. The warmth spread from the stomach outward, a physical relaxation that began before any biochemical sedative effect could have had time to operate. The scent of warm milk is distinctive and deeply associated, for most people who grew up drinking it, with comfort and safety and home. For women who had been given warm milk as children when they could not sleep or when they were sick, or simply as a nighttime ritual, the adult version of the habit carried all of those associations forward. Drinking warm milk before bed was, at some level, being cared for by your own past self, reaching back into the warmth of childhood and bringing it forward into the harder, more complicated warmth of adult life. The glass might be a plain one, or it might be a specific one, the kind of glass that gets attached to a habit through sheer repetition until it becomes inseparable from the ritual. In households where objects were kept and used and cared for across years, rather than replaced every season, those meaningful glass associations could run quite deep. Barbara's depression glass tumbler, Dorothy's specific green glass, Susan's first grown-up glassware, chosen with care because she is building her household from the beginning, and these choices feel important. Milk in those glasses, cold or warm, morning or night, alone in the quiet kitchen, or alongside the family at dinner. The habit was woven into the texture of daily life so completely that removing it would have felt like removing something essential, like a thread pulled from fabric that suddenly shows the structure beneath. I want to come back to the farm connection one more time, because I have more to say about it, and because it is one of the parts of this story that I find most beautiful. The relationship between a suburban or small-town woman and a dairy farm in the 1950s was a relationship with the living world in a way that very few urban or suburban relationships managed to be in that decade. The dairy farm was not scenic or romantic in any conventional sense. It was a working operation built around the needs of animals that had to be milked twice a day every single day of the year, regardless of weather or season or any other factor. The farming family's life was organized entirely around that schedule. The cows set the clock, not the other way around. Women who came to collect milk from such a farm were encountering that reality, even if only briefly, even if only in the form of a quick visit to the farm store or a conversation with the farmer's wife at the back door. They were smelling the particular smell, which is not unpleasant once you know it, but is very specific and very real. They were seeing the barn, the equipment, the evidence of the animals. They were, for the duration of the visit, in direct contact with the food production process that kept their household going. This contact did something. It made the milk real in a way that bottles from the grocery store could not quite replicate. It anchored the habit in something tangible and true. The milk in the refrigerator at home was connected to specific cows on a specific piece of land worked by a specific family. That knowledge had weight. It gave the milk a context, a story, a meaning that went beyond the nutritional label. And the reciprocal relationship, the social fabric woven around the transaction, added another layer. When the farmer's wife mentioned that the Jersey cow had freshened recently and the milk was particularly rich this week, she was sharing knowledge that mattered. When the suburban woman brought preserves from her kitchen as a gesture of appreciation, she was participating in a form of exchange that predated the cash economy, a trading of one form of abundance for another. When they talked, across the truck window or over the farm store counter, about weather and children and community, they were maintaining a connection between two kinds of life that were rapidly diverging in the post-war decades, and that both parties had some interest in keeping alive. These relationships were small, they were not the basis of anything dramatic, but they were real, and they had a value that both parties understood even if they would not have described it in these terms. The milk was the medium, the relationship was the meaning. Let us think now about what happened to the milk habit as the decade progressed and the cultural landscape began to shift. Because the 1950s were not static, and the milk culture of 1952 is not quite the same as the milk culture of 1959, even if the basic habit persisted throughout. The late 1950s saw several changes beginning to accumulate that would, in the following decade, significantly alter the relationship Americans had with milk. The supermarket was completing its consolidation as the primary site of food purchase, and the personal relationships with milkmen and farm dairies were being gradually replaced by more anonymous, more efficient, more impersonal supply chains. The homogenization of commercial milk was becoming universal, which meant the cream line disappearing, the distinctive richness of unhomogenized whole milk giving way to a more uniform and in some ways blander product. The first stirrings of the dietary fat controversy, the early research suggesting a possible link between saturated fat and heart disease, were beginning to appear in medical literature. They had not yet reached popular consciousness in a way that would change behavior at the household level, but they were accumulating, and within a decade they would produce a significant shift in how Americans thought about dairy fat. The whole milk that was so central to the 1950s milk culture would begin its long cultural slide toward being viewed with suspicion, replaced in the popular health imagination by skim milk, and then by reduced fat milk, and then by the current situation in which the milk category itself is contested by a proliferating variety of plant-based alternatives. But that shift was not yet happening at the end of the 1950s, and the women of that decade lived and drank their milk in the last years of a particular nutritional consensus that would not survive the following decade intact. There is something slightly elegiac about this when you look at it from the outside, not because the shift was wrong, exactly, because it incorporated genuine new knowledge and adapted to genuine new understanding, but because the milk culture of the 1950s had a wholeness and a coherence to it, a clear and confident answer to the question of what women should drink and why, that would not be replicated once the certainty began to fragment. The women of that decade drank their milk without ambivalence, without wondering whether they should be drinking oat milk instead, without feeling that the fat content was something to manage or apologize for, without the constant noise of conflicting nutritional advice that characterizes our current relationship with almost every food. They drank it because it was good, and they knew it was good, and the evidence was consistent, and the habit felt right, and in that simplicity there was something almost restful. Let me talk about the ways in which the milk habit intersected with pregnancy and nursing, because this is a significant dimension of the story for a generation of women who were, in the 1950s, Having children in substantial numbers, the baby boom was real, and it was happening in the kitchens and bedrooms of the very women whose milk consumption we have been tracing. The nutritional demands of pregnancy and nursing are substantial, and calcium is one of the most acutely elevated requirements. A pregnant woman needs to provide calcium not just for her own bones, but for the developing skeleton of the fetus, and if her dietary calcium intake is insufficient, the body will draw from her own bone reserves, which is manageable in the short term, but does cumulative damage over the course of multiple pregnancies without adequate dietary replacement. Women in the 1950s who were pregnant or nursing were explicitly told by their doctors and by the women's magazines and by the general cultural consensus to drink more milk. This was one of the most consistent pieces of prenatal advice of the decade. 3 glasses a day might be the standard recommendation for non-pregnant women. For a pregnant woman, the recommendation often went to 4 or 5, enough milk to meet your own needs and the baby's. Women who were already in the habit found this easy to accommodate. Women who had been inconsistent about their milk became more disciplined during pregnancy because the reason was suddenly even more compelling. The growing baby was a highly motivating argument for nutritional responsibility in a way that abstract bone health 10 years in the future simply could not match. After the baby was born and nursing began, the milk recommendation continued. A nursing mother producing milk needed the raw materials for that milk, and those raw materials included calcium and protein in quantities that the diet needed to supply reliably. Drinking whole milk while nursing was understood to support both the mother's own replenishment and the quality of her breast milk, which was not entirely scientifically accurate in its specific mechanism, but reflected a genuine understanding that maternal nutrition during nursing mattered. The women who went through multiple pregnancies in the 1950s, and many of them did, 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 children were not unusual, were drinking their milk through years of pregnancy and nursing and recovery, with brief intervals, building and rebuilding their calcium stores as best they could against the repeated withdrawals that each pregnancy represented. The women who maintained the milk habit most consistently were, statistically, probably in better calcium balance across this period than those who let it lapse. This is another example of the quiet, cumulative, unglamorous work that the milk habit represented. Nobody was celebrating it. Nobody was giving these women credit for the slow, invisible investment they were making in their own long-term health through the simple discipline of daily milk drinking. But the investment was real, and its returns would show up in the decades that followed, in the bones that held and the fractures that did not happen, in the continued physical capability that allowed these women to remain active and independent further into their later lives. Now let us come to something that I find particularly poignant, which is the way the milk habit connected to grief and loss and the experience of aging in the 1950s domestic world. Many of the women who were maintaining the milk habit in the 1950s had mothers and grandmothers who had not had access to the nutritional support that they did. Women who had grown up in the Depression, who had raised families through years of real scarcity, whose own calcium intake over their formative decades had been insufficient for various reasons, were now aging in ways that their daughters could observe and learn from. Osteoporosis, though it was not always named as such, was visible in the bodies of older women of that era. The stooped posture that comes from vertebral compression fractures, the fragility that made ordinary falls dangerous, the sense that a woman's body had become smaller and more brittle as she aged. These were things that 1950s women saw in their mothers and grandmothers, and they registered as warnings about what lay ahead if they did not take care. The milk habit was partly motivated, for many women, by what they had seen happen to the generation before them. They did not want to shrink. They did not want to become fragile. They did not want the particular kind of bodily diminishment that they had watched happen to women who had not had the advantages they did. Drinking their milk every day was one of the ways they said, "I will not let that happen to me if I can help it." There is a dignity and a grief in that, mixed together. The grief of watching your mother's body become less than it had been, and the quiet determination that rises in response to grief, the determination to do differently, to protect yourself, to take the small precautions that are available to you and take them seriously. The women of the 1950s were taking care of themselves in the context of a culture that gave them very few sanctioned ways to do so. The milk was one of those ways, approved by doctors and magazines and neighbors and mothers alike, cost-effective, practical, genuinely beneficial. It fit into the life they were living without requiring them to become someone different. It was just milk, and it was also something more than just milk, in the way that all habits of genuine care are more than they appear on the surface. I want to spend some time now on the specific beauty recipes and preparations of the decade, because they represent a fascinating intersection of folk knowledge, nutritional science, and genuine cosmetic wisdom that deserves more detailed attention than it typically receives. The cold cream that was the foundation of 1950s skincare, that humble mixture of beeswax and oil and water and a touch of fragrance, was often supplemented or replaced in women's home beauty routines by milk-based preparations that were considerably more sophisticated than they might appear. The simplest was just whole milk used as a cleanser. Women who used whole milk to clean their faces were taking advantage of the same oil-dissolving properties that underlie the modern oil cleansing method. The fat in the milk binds to the fats of makeup and skin oils and the day's accumulated grime, and when the milk is wiped away, it takes the bound impurities with it. The residual lactic acid provides a very gentle acid treatment. The result is clean skin that has not been stripped or dried out, which is the fundamental goal of good cleanser design. A more refined version of this used warm milk rather than cold. Warm milk applied to the face and left for a minute before removal was a preparation that appeared in beauty columns of the era as a treatment for dull or tired-looking skin, the kind that results from a poor night's sleep or an overly busy few days. The warmth helped open the pores slightly. The milk did its cleansing work. The skin afterward was brighter and the color more even. Milk and oatmeal was a classic combination that appeared in home beauty guides throughout the decade. Rolled oats were ground to a fine powder, mixed with enough milk to make a paste, applied to the face in a thin layer, left to dry for 15 to 20 minutes, and then removed by gently rubbing with wet hands and rinsing clean. The oatmeal provided gentle physical exfoliation and a soothing anti-inflammatory effect. The milk provided lactic acid and moisturizing properties. Together they produced a mask that cleared congested pores and improved skin texture in a way that the women using it could see and feel in the days following. This preparation is still used today in essentially the same form by people who prefer natural skincare preparations. The formula has not changed because the formula works, and it worked in 1954 for the same reasons it works now. Honey and milk was another classic combination, used both as a face treatment and in some households as a hair treatment. Honey is hygroscopic, meaning it draws moisture from the surrounding environment and holds it against whatever surface it is applied to. Mixed with milk, it created a preparation that was both moisturizing and gently cleansing, suitable particularly for dry or sensitive skin that reacted badly to more aggressive treatments. Women with skin that was easily irritated by stronger preparations often found that milk-based preparations were gentle enough to use without discomfort, while still providing the cleansing and brightening effects they wanted. The skin-tightening properties of egg white were well known in that era, and women sometimes combined egg white with milk to create a temporary firming treatment. Applied to clean skin and allowed to dry, the egg white contracted slightly as it dried, creating a pulling sensation and a temporary tightening effect on fine lines and pores. Adding milk to the preparation smoothed the consistency and prevented the egg white from drying too rigidly. The effect was temporary, lasting only a few hours, but it was real enough to be useful before a social occasion where you particularly wanted your skin to look its best. Cucumber and milk was a preparation specifically aimed at tired eyes and the dark circles and puffiness that followed insufficient sleep, which was an extremely common complaint in a decade when women were managing households, young children, social obligations, and the perpetual low-level anxiety of trying to be perfect at all of it simultaneously. Sliced cucumber, either on its own or soaked briefly in cold milk, placed over closed eyes for 10 to 15 minutes, provided genuine relief through the cooling effect and the mild anti-inflammatory properties of the cucumber. The milk added a gentle softening effect on the skin around the eyes. Women who did this regularly before a social occasion reported looking more rested and less drawn than they actually felt, which in the beauty culture of the decade was the desired outcome. These preparations were genuinely effective within the modest parameters of what topical treatments can accomplish. They were also cheap, accessible to any woman with a refrigerator and a garden or a grocery store, and they had the advantage of being drawn from the same supply of milk that the household was already maintaining for nutritional purposes. There was no separate beauty budget required. The milk in the refrigerator served double duty, and women who were managing household budgets carefully appreciated that efficiency. The skin benefits that women reported from consistent milk consumption and the topical use of milk products reinforced each other in a virtuous cycle. The internal calcium and vitamin A and riboflavin supported the health of skin cells from within. The external lactic acid and fats improved the surface texture and hydration from without. Women who did both felt, and in many cases could see, results that confirmed their investment in the practice. This confirmation was important because it maintained the habit against the inevitable competing demands and alternatives. If you are drinking your milk and washing your face with buttermilk, and your skin is genuinely clearer and softer than it was before, you have a personal, observable, verifiable reason to continue. You are not taking the magazine's word for it. You are taking your own face's word for it. And that is a much stronger foundation for a lasting habit. I want to think now about the experience of milk in the context of the changing seasons, because this is something that the farm connection made particularly vivid and that has been almost entirely lost in the homogenized, year-round consistency of modern commercial dairy. Spring milk was the prized milk. When the dairy herd moved from their winter hay onto the fresh spring grass, the milk changed noticeably in character within a few days. It became richer in color, tending toward a deeper cream that was almost yellow rather than white, because the fresh grass was high in beta-carotene, the precursor to vitamin A, which concentrated in the fat of the milk. The flavor became sweeter and more complex. The cream that rose to the top was denser and richer. Women who got their milk from farm connections would sometimes notice this change and remark on it to the farmer's wife, who might confirm that yes, they put the cows on the south pasture last week and the milk had really come in. This is the kind of intimate, observational, seasonal knowledge that has almost no place in modern food culture, where we expect everything to taste the same in January and July, and where the systems that produce our food are deliberately designed to eliminate exactly these natural variations. For women in the 1950s who maintained a farm connection, the springtime improvement in the milk was a small pleasure, a sign that the world was turning in its right direction, that the season was progressing, and the abundance of spring was beginning to flow into the food supply in its proper way. Summer milk was plentiful and good, though the heat created challenges for keeping it fresh, and the speed with which it needed to be used increased in the warm months. Women who collected milk from farms had to be attentive in summer to how quickly the bottles were going through, and to ensure they were getting fresh milk, often enough that none of it was sitting long enough to spoil. Spoiled milk in a glass bottle is an unmistakable and deeply unpleasant experience, and avoiding it required a form of attention to the food supply that is quite different from the way modern refrigerated supply chains manage food safety. Autumn milk changed again as the herd came back to hay and the pasture grass dried and thinned. The milk became less vivid in color, slightly lower in those fat-soluble vitamins that the fresh grass had concentrated, but still rich and good, still very much worth drinking. And winter milk, from cows on stored hay and grain, was the most consistent and the least exceptional, but it was steady and reliable and available, which in the winter months was its own kind of virtue. Women who paid attention to these seasonal variations were practicing a form of food literacy that is, in our current moment, being consciously recovered by people in the local food and farm-to-table movements. In the 1950s, for women who had the farm connection, it was simply ordinary knowledge, the knowledge that came from paying attention to where your food came from and what affected its quality. It required no particular effort or ideology. It was just what you noticed when you were close enough to the source to notice. Now let me bring us toward the end of the day in a 1950s household, because the evening milk ritual is where I want to rest for a little while before we come to the close of this story. It is after dinner. The dishes have been washed, the children have been bathed and put to bed, the husband is reading or watching television or doing whatever a husband in 1955 does in the evening. The kitchen is clean, the house is quiet, and the woman who has been managing all of it since before sunrise is finally, briefly, alone. She goes to the refrigerator, she takes out the milk, she pours a small saucepan and puts it on the low burner, not to boil, just to warm, just to the temperature where the steam begins to rise from the surface very gently. While it heats, she might be thinking about nothing in particular, or she might be running through the list of tomorrow's tasks, or she might simply be standing in the quiet of the kitchen, listening to the house settle around her. The milk warms slowly. She can see the surface change slightly as the proteins shift with the heat. The smell rises, mild and warm and familiar, a smell that belongs to a specific kind of domestic quiet. She pours it into a mug, maybe the same mug she uses every night, and she stands at the counter and drinks it. She is not performing this for anyone. There is no audience. This is a fully private moment, and in a life that offers very few of those, it has value that goes beyond the calcium and the tryptophan. This is the moment of the day when she is neither wife nor mother nor neighbor nor housekeeper. She is simply a person who has had a long day and is now standing in her kitchen in the quiet warmth of a house that is hers, drinking something warm and being, for a few minutes, entirely herself. The milk is not a luxury, it is not an indulgence. It is not even particularly noteworthy in the way that wine or whiskey might be noteworthy as evening rituals in other households. It is just milk. It is ordinary and good and daily and sufficient. And in a life built around the management of household necessities, there is something right about ending the day with a necessity that also happens to feel like a small kindness to yourself. She rinses the mug and turns out the kitchen light and goes to bed. Tomorrow she will start it again. This is the rhythm that sustained these women through the decade, the quiet accumulation of daily habits that together constituted a kind of self-care so modest and so integrated into domestic duty that it barely registered as self-care at all. But it was. It was the ongoing decision to maintain the body's health, to take the small precautions available, to invest in the future through the small disciplines of the present. The milk was central to that, not because it was magical, or because the advertising had worked on them more than they knew, but because it was genuinely good for them, genuinely pleasurable, genuinely connected to community and tradition and the living world, and genuinely integrated into the fabric of a daily life that was both harder and richer than we tend to remember. Let me say something about the inheritance of this habit, because the women of the 1950s did not simply drink their milk and let the habit end with themselves. They passed it on to their daughters and their daughters' friends and the children they were raising, who absorbed the milk culture of the decade and carried some version of it forward. The daughters of the 1950s housewives grew up knowing that milk mattered. They might later revise the specific reasons, might learn that the relationship between dairy and health was more complicated than the simple version their mothers had been taught, might switch to skim milk or reduce their dairy intake entirely in response to the conflicting nutritional messages of the 1970s and 1980s. But they had the habit in their bodies from childhood, the muscle memory of reaching for milk, the basic comfort of the substance, the understanding that it was part of what the body needed. And some of them, the ones who paid careful attention to their bodies across their adult lives, kept some version of the practice, kept drinking their milk or their yogurt or their cheese, maintained their calcium intake through the years when it was most needed, and arrived at midlife in better bone health than women who had let the dairy habit lapse entirely. Not because the 1950s version of the nutritional story was perfectly correct in every detail, but because the core recommendation that women need adequate calcium throughout their adult lives has never really been superseded, only refined. The specific cultural form of the habit has changed almost beyond recognition. The milkman is gone. The farm connection that many women maintained is largely gone. The glass bottles and the cream line and the particular flavor of unhomogenized whole milk from a local herd are largely gone, surviving only in specialty contexts and among people who specifically seek them out. The certainty and unanimity of the mid-century nutritional consensus has been replaced by a much noisier and more contested landscape in which almost every food claim is disputed by some credible voice. But the underlying reality that milk was tending to has not changed. Women's bones still lose density with age. Calcium and vitamin D still matter for preventing that loss. Adequate protein still matters for muscle maintenance. The beauty benefits of dairy nutrition, while not as simple as the 1950s magazines suggested, are real enough that dermatologists continue to talk about the relationship between diet and skin health. The habit was pointing towards something true, even when the specific claims were sometimes exaggerated. But her body is receiving something. The calcium is there, and the protein, and the vitamin D, and the small pleasure of a substance that is cold and good and nourishing. She will put the glass in the sink and go back to whatever she was doing, and the milk will do its quiet work in her body over the hours and days and years that follow, building the foundation that will hold her upright and strong into her later life. She does not know this. She is not thinking about it. She is just standing in her kitchen drinking her milk, the way she does every day, the way her mother did, the way the magazine says to, the way the doctor advises, the way all her neighbors do. And it is enough. It is, in its small and unglamorous way, exactly enough. These women carried something in their daily habits that is worth remembering. Not the specific details, which belong to their particular moment in time and cannot simply be transplanted into ours, but the underlying quality, the willingness to tend to the body's needs without drama, without special occasion, without waiting for someone to tell them they had earned a moment of care. The daily discipline of the small good thing, repeated until it becomes part of the structure of the day, as natural as breathing, as ordinary as getting up in the morning. They drank their milk, and through the drinking they maintained their health and their beauty and their connections to farms and neighbors and the seasons and the small pleasures of the body. And they went about their days and they were, in this particular respect, wiser than they knew. For most of human history, people ate what was available, in the quantities available, and their understanding of why some foods were better for them than others was a loose tangle of tradition, religious prescription, folk wisdom, and practical observation. You knew that eating spoilt meat made you sick. You knew that certain plants were poisonous. You knew that children who didn't get enough to eat didn't grow as tall. But the specific mechanisms, the understanding of what a food was actually doing inside a body at the chemical level, that was almost entirely absent until the very end of the 19th century. And then, in a remarkably compressed period of time, everything changed. Between roughly 1880 and 1920, scientists working in laboratories across Europe and the United States made a series of discoveries that fundamentally rewrote the human relationship to food. They identified the existence of proteins and began to understand how the body used them. They discovered that fat was not simply a source of warmth, but a carrier of substances the body couldn't produce on its own. And then, most dramatically, they found the vitamins, those small and extraordinary molecules whose absence produced specific, identifiable, catastrophic diseases, and whose presence kept the body humming along in ways that were suddenly, for the first time, scientifically legible. Vitamin C, vitamin A, the B vitamins, vitamin D. Each discovery landed with the force of a small revolution because each one came with a story. The story of scurvy among sailors who ate no fresh fruit. The story of rickets in the crowded, sunless tenements of industrial cities. Children with bowed legs and soft bones who were not getting enough of a substance that had no name yet. The story of pellagra devastating communities in the American South who lived on corn and little else. These diseases were the photographic negatives of what good nutrition looked like, and once scientists could see them clearly, they could also begin to see what prevented them. And milk, it turned out, was extraordinarily well positioned in this new nutritional landscape. Milk is, in a certain sense, nature's most complete food for the early stages of mammalian life. It contains protein in a form the body absorbs efficiently. It contains fat. It contains calcium in quantities that almost nothing else in the human diet can match. And crucially, in the early 20th century, it became one of the first foods to be artificially supplemented with vitamin D, the vitamin whose deficiency caused rickets, and which most people in cloudy northern climates were not getting enough of from sunlight alone. The timing was not accidental. The discovery of vitamins and the rise of the modern American dairy industry happened more or less simultaneously, and they found each other the way all-powerful cultural forces eventually do, with a kind of enthusiasm that serves both parties beautifully. Dairy industry trade groups and the federal government, through agencies like the Department of Agriculture and eventually what would become the Food and Drug Administration, began working together in ways that seem, from the vantage point of today, almost staggeringly effective. Nutrition education in schools, campaigns in women's magazines, doctor endorsements, the development of dietary guidelines that placed milk at the center of a healthy diet in ways that would persist for decades, long past the point when the science actually supported such a central placement. But in the 1940s and 1950s, none of that complexity was particularly visible. What was visible was something much simpler and much more powerful. Milk was the food that science and medicine agreed was good for you. It was the food that doctors recommended. It was the food that the government included in its official nutritional charts. It was the food that mothers gave their children to make them grow strong, and the food that women were told to drink themselves to stay healthy and maintain the beauty that their culture told them was both their responsibility and their ticket to a certain kind of social survival. You could not drink milk in the 1950s without drinking all of that history along with it. Now, let me take you into the specific moment, because the 1950s were not just any decade in American history. They were a decade of extraordinary self-consciousness about what it meant to live well, to be healthy, to be a proper American woman in a world that had just survived something enormous and was working very hard to convince itself that the future would be ordinary and safe and prosperous and clean. The war had ended in 1945, the men had come home, and as we talked about in other evenings together, the cultural machinery had immediately turned its full force toward convincing everyone that women's highest purpose was the domestic one, the well-run household, the happy children. The husband served a good breakfast before he left for work. All of it. But underneath the relentless messaging about what women should be doing, there was something else happening. The post-war economic boom was real. Disposable income was rising. Consumer goods were becoming available at prices that ordinary families could actually afford. The refrigerator that had been a luxury before the war was now a standard feature of the American kitchen. The milkman delivering glass bottles to the front step was a daily presence in millions of neighborhoods, and all of that infrastructure, the cold chain that kept milk safe from cow to table, the pasteurization that made it reliably non-lethal, the homogenization that kept the cream from separating, all of it was in place and humming. Milk had never been more available, more affordable, more technologically reliable, and more enthusiastically endorsed by every authority figure a 1950s housewife might plausibly listen to. And the housewives listened. They really did. Let me tell you about what the average woman was being told about milk in 1952. Not in the abstract, but specifically in the actual publications that were sitting on her coffee table and in her kitchen drawer. Better Homes and Gardens, which was one of the most widely read magazines in the country during this period, ran regular features on nutrition and health that hammered home a consistent message. Milk was essential, not helpful, not beneficial, not something you might want to consider. Essential. The language was that of necessity, not suggestion. Your family's health depended on adequate milk consumption. The dairy industry's advertising, which was lavish and clever and everywhere, had thoroughly seeded this belief into the culture, and it bloomed in editorial content that was not technically advertising but might as well have been. The recommended daily intake for adult women was 2 to 3 glasses of fluid milk per day, and this was not considered extraordinary. It was considered the minimum. Magazines ran charts, doctors kept those charts in their offices, the National Dairy Council distributed educational materials to schools and community organizations. The 4 food groups, that government-endorsed nutritional framework that would dominate American dietary thinking from 1956 well into the 1980s, placed dairy alongside meat and grains and fruits and vegetables as one of the 4 essential pillars of a healthy diet. 2 servings of dairy per day, every day, was the official recommendation, and a serving was a glass of milk. That was the assumed form. Not cheese, not yogurt, not cream in your coffee, a glass of cold milk. So what did this mean in practice? It meant that the well-informed, health-conscious 1950s housewife was drinking milk with breakfast, probably, and then again at some point during the day, and encouraging her husband to do the same, and making sure her children drank it at every meal and sometimes in between. The kitchen consumed milk the way the car consumed gasoline, as a basic operating expense, a non-negotiable requirement of keeping the household running properly. But here is the thing I keep coming back to, the thing that I find genuinely interesting when I sit with this history. The milk was not just functional, it was also meaningful, and the meaning it carried was specifically feminine, specifically connected to the particular pressures and pleasures of being a woman in post-war America. Let me explain what I mean. The 1950s were, as historians have documented in detail, a deeply strange moment for American women's relationship to their own bodies. On one hand, there was an enormous cultural emphasis on the female body as a site of beauty and sexual attractiveness, shaped and controlled and presented for the benefit of husbands and potential husbands and the social world at large. The right figure, the right skin, the right hair, the right posture, all of this was a woman's responsibility to maintain, and the maintenance required constant vigilance and effort. On the other hand, there was almost no mainstream cultural permission for women to think about their health in ways that extended beyond the cosmetic. Women were not, by and large, encouraged to think of themselves as athletes or as people with bodies that needed strengthening and conditioning for their own sake. They were not encouraged to think about bone density or cardiovascular health or the long-term consequences of nutritional deficiencies on aging. These were not the conversations happening in women's magazines in 1952. The conversation was about how to look good and how to keep your husband happy and how to run a household efficiently. And into this gap, milk arrived carrying a message that was, at least partly, genuinely useful. Because the truth is that the specific nutrients in milk, the calcium and the protein and the vitamin D, were exactly what the female body needed in ways that the cultural conversation around women's health almost never discussed in any other context. Bone density in women peaks in the late 20s and early 30s and begins a long, slow decline after that, accelerating sharply after menopause. The calcium a woman consumed throughout her life, but especially in her 20s and 30s, determined how much bone she had in reserve when that decline began. Low calcium in early adulthood meant significantly higher risk of osteoporosis in later life, of the fractures and the shrinking and the loss of independence that came with fragile bones. Nobody in 1952 was talking to women about osteoporosis, not in those terms, not with that framework, but they were talking to women about drinking their milk, and the two things were, in ways that nobody at the time fully articulated, connected. There is something both wonderful and melancholy about that gap. The right behavior, arrived at through the wrong justification, producing real benefit for reasons that went largely unacknowledged. Women were told to drink milk because it was good for them, because it kept them healthy and strong, because it supported their beauty and their energy and their ability to care for their families. And all of that was true, in its way. But the deeper truth, that they were building the structural foundation of their own skeletons, that they were protecting their future autonomy and their future capacity to move through the world without pain, that was not the story anyone was telling. Instead, let me tell you about the beauty angle. Because in the 1950s, the beauty angle was everything, and milk had a very specific role to play in it. The post-war ideal of feminine beauty, which I am sure you can picture without much prompting, was particular in its requirements. The hourglass figure, of course, the smooth, clear, luminous skin, the glossy hair, the strong nails, the general impression of healthy bloom, of a woman who was well-fed but not overfed, well-rested but not idle, glowing with the kind of vitality that suggested she was doing everything right. And milk was marketed explicitly as a beauty food. Not metaphorically, not implicitly. The advertisement said so directly. Milk for beautiful skin, milk for strong, healthy nails, milk for the kind of hair that gleams in the sunlight. The dairy industry's marketing departments had done their homework, and they had found in the genuine nutritional science a set of real connections they could honestly promote. The protein in milk really did support hair and nail growth. The vitamins really did support skin health. The overall package of nutrition that a glass of milk provided really did contribute to the kind of healthy physical appearance that the culture was demanding of women. So the beauty message and the health message and the domestic responsibility message all converged on the same glass of cold milk, and women received all three simultaneously every time they poured one. Let me take you into a specific kitchen now, because the abstraction of all this cultural pressure needs a physical home to live in. Let us say it is a Tuesday morning in October 1953. The house is in a suburb of Columbus, Ohio, which might as well be anywhere in Middle America, because the point is that this house looks like 1,000 other houses on 1,000 other streets in 1,000 other towns across the country. The woman of the house, let us call her Carol, is 31 years old. She has 2 children, a boy of 7 and a girl of 4. Her husband left for work an hour ago. The children have been fed, and the boy has been sent off to school, and the girl is playing in the other room, and the breakfast dishes are waiting in the sink, and Carol is standing at the kitchen counter with 5 minutes that are entirely her own. She opens the refrigerator. She takes out one of the milk bottles. She pours a glass, not a full glass, because she is the kind of woman who rations things, who adds a little less of everything just in case, who has grown up understanding that there is never quite enough, and that waste is a small but real sin. She drinks it standing up. She does not sit down for this. There is no ritual to it, no moment of deliberate pleasure, no awareness that she is doing something worth noticing. She is just drinking her milk the way she drinks her milk, every morning, because it is what you do. But I want to tell you what is happening while she stands there, because that part is interesting. Carol grew up in a household where her mother drank milk too, and before that, in a farming community where milk came from cows that her family knew by name. The connection between the substance in the bottle and the living animal that produced it is, for her generation, still relatively recent. She is old enough to remember when milk was something that came from a farm rather than a factory, when it had a different taste and a different smell and a different relationship to the land and the seasons. She is young enough to have grown up with pasteurized milk as the norm, to have no actual memory of the health scares that surrounded raw milk in the decades before widespread pasteurization took hold. She stands at the intersection of these two worlds, the agricultural world her parents came from and the suburban consumer world she now inhabits, and the milk she is drinking carries traces of both. There is also the question of what she has been told about her body and its needs, which is where the decade presses most heavily on the ordinary moment of this ordinary morning. Carol has been to the doctor recently, a routine visit, and her doctor, who is a man of course, has told her that she is in good health but that she should make sure she is getting enough calcium. Her bones, he has implied without quite saying, are the kind of thing a woman needs to pay attention to as she gets older. He has mentioned milk. He has mentioned the importance of dairy. He has said these things in a tone that was not alarming, but was clearly advisory, and Carol, who respects doctors the way her generation respects doctors, has taken the advice to heart. She is also, though she would not phrase it this way, slightly anxious about her own body, in the way that the decade has taught women to be anxious about their bodies. Not in a consuming way, not a clinical anxiety, just the low-level hum of awareness that her appearance and her health are both things she is responsible for maintaining, that they do not simply take care of themselves, and that if something goes wrong, it will in some meaningful way be her fault. The milk is, among other things, a way of managing that anxiety. She is doing the right thing. She is taking care of herself. The glass in her hand is evidence that she is not neglecting the body that her family and her culture and her doctor are all depending on her to keep in good working order. She finishes the milk, she rinses the glass, she gets on with her day, and this is what I mean when I say the milk was meaningful in ways that extended beyond simple nutrition. It was woven into the texture of how women in that decade understood their responsibilities to themselves and to everyone else. It was not merely something they drank, it was something they did, a daily practice that connected them to their health and their beauty and their families and the wider cultural conversation about what it meant to be a good woman, taking proper care of herself and the people in her charge. Let me spend some time with the science now, because the science is genuinely interesting, and because I want you to understand what milk was actually doing in those bodies, separate from what the culture was saying it was doing. Whole milk in the 1950s was exactly that, whole. Homogenized, meaning the fat had been mechanically distributed throughout the liquid so it didn't separate, but not reduced. The fat content of a glass of whole milk is roughly 3 to 4%, which means that an 8-ounce glass contains about 8 grams of fat, around 3 of which are saturated. It also contains 8 grams of protein, 12 grams of carbohydrate in the form of lactose, and in vitamin D fortified milk, which had become the standard by the mid-1940s, a substantial portion of the daily recommended intake of that particular vitamin. The calcium content of a single glass of milk, around 300 milligrams, is genuinely impressive relative to most other common foods. Dark leafy greens contain calcium, but in forms that are somewhat less bioavailable, and in 1953 most Americans were not eating the quantities of kale or collard greens that would make them a viable alternative source. Beans contain calcium, almonds contain calcium, fish with edible bones, sardines, canned salmon, contain calcium. But none of these foods were culturally positioned as calcium sources. None of them had the backing of a powerful industry and a government endorsement and a doctor's recommendation and a magazine article telling you to eat more of them. Milk had all of those things, and so milk was what women reached for. And for the particular nutritional deficiencies that were most likely to be affecting American women in the post-war period, the recommendation was not wrong. It was in fact quite right. The science supporting calcium's role in bone health was not yet fully developed in 1952, but the empirical observation that adequate dairy consumption seemed to correlate with better skeletal health was solid. The understanding of vitamin D's role in calcium absorption was clear. The evidence for milk's contribution to overall nutritional adequacy in populations that were not eating particularly diverse diets was real. The story gets more complicated when you look at what happened to the science over the following decades, when researchers began to examine more carefully what the fat in whole milk was doing, what the relationship between saturated fat and cardiovascular disease might be, and whether the benefits of dairy consumption that had seemed so clear-cut in the 1950s were actually as universal and as unambiguous as they had appeared. But that is a story for another evening. For now, in the specific moment we are examining, the science and the cultural message were more or less aligned, and the women drinking their milk were getting something real from it. Let us talk about the doctors for a moment, because the medical profession's relationship to milk in the 1950s is its own fascinating chapter. The figure of the family doctor in post-war America occupies a cultural position that is somewhat difficult to convey from the vantage point of the present, when we are all accustomed to researching our own symptoms online and questioning our doctors and seeking second opinions and maintaining a generally skeptical relationship to medical authority. In 1952, the family doctor was an authority figure of a different order entirely. He, and it was almost always he, was one of the most trusted people in a community. His word carried an enormous amount of weight. His recommendations were followed not because patients had independently evaluated the evidence and found it persuasive, but because he was the doctor and he knew. And the doctors of the 1950s, by and large, told their patients to drink milk, told their pregnant patients to drink even more milk, told their patients who were nursing infants to drink milk to support milk production, told their patients' children to drink milk at every meal. This was not fringe advice or controversial recommendation. It was the mainstream medical consensus, endorsed by the American Medical Association, consistent with the dietary guidelines being promulgated by the federal government, and aligned with everything the dairy industry had been promoting for decades. The doctor who told Carol to make sure she was getting enough calcium was not acting as a shill for the dairy lobby. He genuinely believed, as did his colleagues and as did the mainstream scientific literature of the time, that adequate milk consumption was an important component of women's health. He was drawing on real evidence and real professional consensus. The fact that later decades would complicate that picture significantly does not change the sincerity with which the advice was given in the moment. And women received that advice with the same deference they brought to medical authority generally. If the doctor said drink your milk, you drank your milk. It was not a difficult instruction to follow, and it came wrapped in the reassurance that you were doing something medically correct, something that had professional approval, something that demonstrated your commitment to the responsible management of your health. Now here is something that I think is genuinely underappreciated about milk in this particular decade, something that the cultural and medical narratives tend to obscure because they are so loud and because the story of post-war America is so often told from the perspective of the big forces, the industry lobbying and the government guidelines and the magazine advertising. The thing that is underappreciated is pleasure. Women in the 1950s also drank milk because it was, for many of them, genuinely pleasant. This sounds almost too obvious to say, but I think it matters because the narrative of the decade tends to reduce women to passive recipients of cultural messaging, which they were not. They were also people with actual preferences and actual physical experiences and actual relationships to the foods they consumed. Whole milk, cold from the refrigerator, is a physically satisfying beverage in ways that are quite specific. The fat content creates a particular texture on the tongue, a richness and a slight viscosity that thinner liquids don't have. The lactose provides a mild sweetness that is different from the sweetness of juice or soda, gentler and less sharp. The temperature, when it is properly cold, is genuinely refreshing, and there is a satiety to a glass of whole milk that a glass of water or a cup of weak tea does not provide. It fills something. It quiets the stomach in a way that is recognizable and real. For women who were, as we discussed in our conversation about 1950s housewives, often skimping on their own meals, often eating in rushed bites between serving everyone else, often not sitting down properly for their own nourishment, a glass of milk was a way of consuming something genuinely nutritious and genuinely filling in a minimal amount of time with minimal fuss. It was portable, in the sense that you could drink it standing up at the kitchen counter without having to sit down and make a meal of it. It was immediate in a way that cooking something was not. It was complete in the sense of providing protein and fat and carbohydrate and calcium all at once, without requiring any preparation. There is something about this that resonates across the decades. The specific appeal of a food that is nourishing and easy and quick for people who are busy and often not particularly focused on feeding themselves well. We see it today in different forms. The protein shake grabbed on the way out the door, the yogurt eaten over the sink, a handful of nuts consumed at a desk. The impulse is the same, to give the body something it needs in the fastest, most convenient way available. For a 1950s housewife, milk was that food, and the pleasure of it, the cold richness of it, the satisfaction of it, was real and was part of why women reached for it so consistently. Let me tell you about the milkman, because no conversation about milk in the 1950s is complete without him, and because he represents something that has been almost entirely lost from American domestic life and that carried its own particular significance. The milkman made his rounds before dawn in most neighborhoods. The glass bottles, white with cream at the top in the years before homogenization became universal, were placed in an insulated metal box on the front step, or directly in the special cubby built into the side of the house for exactly this purpose. The empty bottles from the previous delivery were left out to be collected. The whole system operated on a kind of quiet, reliable reciprocity that was distinctly different from the experience of buying food at a grocery store. The milkman knew his customers. He knew how much each family took, which families needed extra on certain days, which houses had new babies or sick members whose needs might have shifted. He was, in a certain sense, part of the domestic infrastructure, in a way that the anonymous shelves of the grocery store never quite managed to be. And for the women who were home during the day, managing the household while their husbands were at work, this daily delivery was part of the rhythm of the house. You heard the clink of the bottles in the morning. You knew the milk was there. You incorporated it into the day's planning without having to think about it much, because the milkman had taken care of that part. The shift away from home milk delivery and towards supermarket purchase of milk in the late 1950s and into the 1960s was one of those changes that seemed small but that altered the texture of domestic life in ways that are hard to quantify. The milk was still there, still cold, still the same substance, but the relationship to it had changed. It was now just another item in the cart, another thing to remember to put on the list, another task in the management of the household, rather than a service that arrived at your door and removed itself when it was finished. I do not want to romanticize the milkman too much, because the reality of home delivery was also that it was expensive relative to supermarket pricing, and that the glass bottles required careful handling, and that the whole system was in some ways more labor-intensive than the refrigerator section at the A&P. But the loss of that particular form of service was a small diminishment of the domestic world, and I think it is worth acknowledging. Now let me turn to something more complex, because the story of milk in the 1950s is not only a story of health and pleasure and convenient nutrition, it is also, inevitably, a story of class and of race and of who had access to what, and what the cultural ideal of the milk-drinking housewife was actually standing in for. The image of the healthy, well-nourished suburban woman drinking her daily milk was, in the 1950s, an image that was implicitly and often explicitly white. The dairy industry's marketing, the government's nutritional campaigns, the magazine articles, and the doctor's advice, and the milkman's route, all of it was constructed with a specific vision of American domesticity that was racially coded in ways that were pervasive and that shaped who the message reached and how it was received. Black women in the 1950s were navigating a completely different domestic landscape. Many of them were working outside the home in ways that the white suburban housewife mythology pretended did not exist. Many of them lived in urban neighborhoods that were not served by the same milkman routes, or in rural areas where the infrastructure of the modern dairy industry had not yet fully penetrated. Many of them were living at economic margins that made the daily purchase of milk a genuine budget consideration rather than an unexamined habit. And there is also the biological reality of lactose intolerance, which runs at much higher rates in populations of African, Asian, and indigenous descent than in populations of Northern European ancestry. The ability to digest lactose, the sugar in milk, through adulthood is actually a genetic mutation that is relatively recent in evolutionary terms and that spread through Northern European populations because of the advantages it provided in cultures that relied heavily on dairy farming. Most of the world's human population loses much of this digestive enzyme after early childhood, making the consumption of large quantities of fluid milk uncomfortable or genuinely distressing. The recommendation to drink 2 to 3 glasses of milk per day was, in this sense, a recommendation calibrated to the digestive capabilities of one specific slice of the human population and presented as universal, as though it applied equally to everyone. This is a failure of the nutritional science of the period that had real consequences for communities who were being told to adopt dietary patterns that their bodies were not well equipped to handle. This is part of the complicated legacy of the post-war milk boom. The thing that was, in many genuine ways, beneficial to the specific population it was designed for, was built on assumptions of universality that were not warranted and that caused harm when applied without acknowledgement of biological and cultural difference. Let me set that complexity down for a moment, not because it is unimportant, it is very important, but because I want to return to the individual woman in the individual kitchen, and I want to follow the milk through the rest of her day. Because Carol's morning glass was not the end of milk's presence in her kitchen, not even close. The 1950s American kitchen, as any cookbook from the period will confirm with the kind of thoroughness that can only be described as enthusiastic, used milk in cooking constantly and in quantities that we would find startling today, not as an occasional ingredient, not as a splash added here or there, but as a fundamental cooking medium, a base and a binder and a liquid component in dishes across the full range of what was prepared at home. Cream soups, white sauce, which appeared in forms ranging from the barely flavored to the richly seasoned, and which was used to turn almost any combination of vegetables and protein into a casserole. Puddings, custards, pancake batter, muffin recipes that called for a cup of milk, the cream of wheat that appeared on many breakfast tables, mashed potatoes enriched with whole milk and butter, macaroni and cheese, which in the 1950s often began with a milk-based cheese sauce made from scratch, rather than coming from an orange powder in a box. The Betty Crocker Picture Cookbook, which was published in 1950 and became one of the best-selling cookbooks in American history, is a document that any student of the decade's food culture should spend time with because it captures with beautiful specificity what the American kitchen of the period actually looked like from the inside. And what it reveals, among other things, is that milk was present in that kitchen at every turn. The recipes assume it. They call for it casually and in quantity, the way recipes today might call for olive oil, as something that is simply there, always available, not a special purchase. A well-run 1950s household went through milk at a rate that would astonish most modern families. Between the direct drinking and the cooking and the children's consumption at every meal, a family of 4 might easily consume 2 gallons or more per week. The refrigerator that was itself a symbol of modern domestic achievement held at its center this most traditional of foods in its most modern and convenient and scientifically endorsed form. Let me tell you about the social dimension of milk, because I think this is an aspect of the story that often gets overlooked in favor of the health and beauty angles, and it is genuinely interesting. The mother who made sure her family drank enough milk was performing a specific kind of domestic competence that had real social currency in the 1950s community. Nutritional knowledge was considered part of household management skill, in the same way that knowing how to roast a chicken, or stretch a budget, or keep the house clean was part of it. A woman who was informed about what her family needed to eat, and who ensured they were eating it, was doing her job well. A woman who let her children go without adequate nutrition was failing at a fundamental responsibility. This might sound oppressive, and in some ways it was, because it added another item to the already crushing list of things women were expected to manage, and manage perfectly, without support or recognitions. But it also meant that nutritional knowledge was taken seriously as something women should have and apply, which was, in a period when women were being systematically excluded from most domains of professional expertise and intellectual authority, a small but real acknowledgement that domestic knowledge mattered and required genuine competence. The neighborhood conversations about food and nutrition that happened over back fences and at coffee clutches and in the checkout line at the grocery store were, in part, conversations about milk. How much are you having the kids drink? Have you read that article in Good Housekeeping about calcium? My doctor says I should be having more dairy. These were the exchanges of women who were taking seriously the responsibility of keeping their families healthy, and who were doing so with the tools and information available to them. There was also the specific social meaning of milk for children, which in the 1950s was almost beyond questioning. Children drank milk. This was not a preference or a parental choice that was up for debate. It was a given, like the requirement that children sleep and go to school. The healthy child was a milk-drinking child. The mother who sent her child to school without a proper breakfast that included milk was, in the cultural shorthand of the decade, not quite doing her job. School lunch programs in the post-war period included milk as a mandatory component in federally subsidized meals, a policy that reflected both genuine nutritional concern and the effective lobbying of the dairy industry, and that embedded milk in the daily experience of an entire generation of American children in ways that shaped their lifelong assumptions about what a proper meal looked like. Children who grew up in the 1950s drinking milk at every meal in school and at home were, by adulthood, people for whom a glass of milk was simply part of the furniture of daily life. When they formed their own households and made their own decisions about what to buy at the grocery store, milk went in the cart without much deliberation, because that was what you bought, that was what was in the refrigerator, that was what the family drank. This transmission of dietary habit across generations is, I think, part of what sustained the high consumption levels well into the 1960s, even as the specific cultural messaging around milk began to evolve. The habit had been set early, reinforced constantly, and embedded in the structure of the daily routine in ways that are hard to dislodge. Let me take a moment to talk about something that does not come up much in the standard telling of this story, which is what happened to women's bodies over time as a result of this particular dietary pattern. The calcium intake of women who were drinking 2 to 3 glasses of milk per day through their 20s, 30s and 40s was, by current standards, genuinely substantial. The National Osteoporosis Foundation recommends 1,000 milligrams of calcium per day for women under 50, rising to 1,200 for women over 50. 3 8-ounce glasses of whole milk provide roughly 900 milligrams, which gets you most of the way to the lower recommendation and puts a meaningful dent in the higher one, especially when you add the calcium being consumed through cooking with milk and through other dairy products. The women of the 1950s who were following the cultural norm and drinking their daily milk were, without knowing it in these terms, doing something genuinely useful for their future selves. The skeleton they were building in those years, the bone density they were accumulating and then preserving through adequate calcium intake, would matter enormously when they reached their 50s and 60s and 70s and beyond. Women who entered menopause in the 1970s and 1980s, which means women who had been in their prime in the 1950s and 1960s, would face the significant bone density loss that accompanies the hormonal changes of that transition, but they would face it from a starting point that had been built partly by the daily habit of drinking their milk. The baseline would be higher, the reserves would be greater, the margin between adequate bone density and the threshold of clinical concern would be wider. We cannot know exactly how much the milk habits of the 1950s contributed to the skeletal health of women in later life, because the study of bone density across populations is complicated, and because the variables at play are many, and because the women who were young in the 1950s are not a controlled experimental group. But the biological logic is sound, and the evidence that calcium intake during the bone-building years of young adulthood matters for long-term bone health is now extremely well established. So Carol, standing at her kitchen counter in 1953 drinking her morning milk while thinking about something else entirely, was doing something for her 70-year-old self that her 70-year-old self would not know to thank her for. The debt would never be acknowledged. The connection would never be made, but it was real. That is a kind of quiet grace, I think. The care that is taken without awareness of being taken, the benefit that is received without knowledge of the gift. It is not the most romantic framing of daily calcium intake, but it has a certain truth to it. Let me return now to the texture of the daily experience, because I want to stay close to the specific and the sensory for a little while before we move into the broader forces at work. The glass of milk in the 1950s kitchen was not always cold. This is a detail worth noting, because it runs against the modern assumption that milk is always refrigerated and always consumed cold. The refrigerators of the period were real refrigerators, properly cold, and the milk stored in them was properly chilled. But there were circumstances under which milk appeared at room temperature or warmed, and these were not considered odd or undesirable. A glass of warm milk before bed was a standard recommendation for sleep, based on the belief, which has some actual physiological support, that the tryptophan in milk contributes to the production of serotonin and melatonin, the neurochemicals associated with relaxation and sleep onset. The scientific evidence for this effect, at the quantities present in a single glass of milk, is modest, but the cultural belief was strong, and the warm glass of milk at bedtime was a comforting ritual that existed alongside the cold glass at breakfast, as the two poles of milk consumption through the day. And that, I think, is a beautiful thing, a small and quiet and very human beautiful thing. If you have been here tonight on Sleepy Old World for the first time, I am so glad the story found you, and if you have been here before, thank you for coming back. This channel exists because stories like this one, the small overlooked human stories that history usually walks right past, deserve to be told slowly and carefully, and with the attention they have earned. If you are still awake and wanted to leave a comment, I would love to know where you are in the world right now, and if tonight's story felt like something you want more of, the subscribe button is there when you are ready. It helps more than you know. Now, let the glass be empty. Let the kitchen be quiet. Let the house settle around you. You have heard the story of the milk, and it is a good one, and it is done. Sleep well.